Welcome to Season 2, Episode 2 of the Data Driven Strength Podcast. We are back in the Batcave, here to talk about outcome number 2 out of 4. Before we dive into what we're going to be chatting about today, Zach, how we doing? How we feeling one day after first loss of the season for the Buckeyes?
Yeah, frankly, terrible. That was a tough one. I think, I don't have many words, honestly. That it was pretty disappointing.
There's a lot of questions. We have more questions than answers.
Yeah, that was. We've gotten a few positive comments, whether that be DMs or things of fellow Buckeye fans who listen to the podcast. So it's good to always get that initial segment on the show. So all our fellow listeners who are repping the Scarlet and Gray. This one's gonna take some time to heal, lick our wounds a little bit, come together, as a band of brothers, and get back out there on the gridiron and bring home this natty. I think we're gonna have another shot at the Ducks in the Big Ten championship game. That'll be a cool one. But now we got a big game coming at Penn State eventually, which will likely be Penn State will probably be undefeated, and that's gonna be
They might be ranked higher than Ohio State.
Oh yeah, it's gonna be a test.
Were they ranked higher than Ohio State in? Was it 2019?
When JT brought him back?
Yeah.
I can't remember.
Were they ranked higher? I think that was a top 5 matchup.
Yeah, that was a good game.
That is the game where I got bit by the college football bug. I've always kind of been into sports growing up, but then honestly, when I started getting into like training and preparing for playing sports, I started caring a lot more about that than, and I really didn't follow any sports. Like growing up, I was a diehard Chicago Cubs fan, diehard Chicago Bulls fan. And then I kind of stopped caring about sports, mostly because my teams never amounted to anything. But then I went to Ohio State for college. And, I went to the games because that's what people did. It was kind of a big deal. It was fun. But then that 2019, I think it's 2019, Ohio State-Penn State game, that changed everything. And I was like, wow, this is incredible, especially those big-time matchups. I regularly go back and watch the condensed game of that. On YouTube, and it's that was fantastic.
Yeah, we'll not belabor this point too much, but yeah, ultimately
more college football talk to come.
More college football talk to come this week. We'll give the Ducks their due. Played well.
They played well. They looked good.
Dylan Gabriel looked insane. He's the better player, I think, on that evening. But Chip will get the boys right. Get back on the field in a winning event.
Shout out to the 12-team playoff.
Yeah, no, honestly, I think it in some ways makes the regular season matter less in some cases, but also matter more in other cases. So, I don't know. It's a good kickoff for the season. Obviously, not the way we wanted to go, but that's basically how I'm doing. So, how about you?
I'd say about the same. I'm looking forward to getting this podcast out there because this will conclude the hypertrophy outcomes. So we, as many of you will know, we released a 5-hour podcast on one of 4 outcomes from the paper. And just naturally, the effects of volume on hypertrophy are going to get a little bit more attention, especially just given the results themselves. We thought there was a lot to discuss there, a lot of limitations and color to add to what goes into meta-analysis in general and specifically our project. So I think it was really good that we prioritize that. But we also want to do the other topics just as well, or the other outcomes. So today will be the effects of frequency on hypertrophy outcomes. We also have the effects of volume on strength outcomes, the effects of frequency on strength outcomes, and then we're also going to have a podcast with Jake Remmert discussing per session volumes. And I'm sure there's going to be some additional trickle-down episodes as well. For example, we even discussed potentially having a second volume and hypertrophy podcast instead of doing this one next because there's already been some misinterpretations, many of which were honestly covered in that first episode, but I think we could add some more clarity, provide some more nuance to that.
I think the major thing is you can't ever guess how people are going to put weight on certain things. I think that's ultimately what it always comes down to is I think we did a pretty good job on basically calling our shot on how things are going to be misinterpreted, but the weight and the what part of things is going to end up being the thing that kind of goes down the telephone rabbit hole is just something you can never predict. And I think that's ultimately what a cleanup episode. But we could probably combine that once we go through all of these. Give it a little more time to be out there, a little more time to see what people think. because it was a massive project. It was very long. I think it's something that's always hilarious to me, frankly, is
the takes within less than 24 hours.
Man, dude, it's unbelievable. Like
Yeah.
I just have a hard time thinking that people give it the amount of consideration that
Yeah,
it
in a lot
requires.
of ways, at least when we put our researcher hat on, I think some of the best feedback, or questions or critiques even, which we more than welcome, are gonna come multiple weeks, if not months, after the project is out. We've spoken to people that, whether they've directly studied volume before, or not, they might kind of fall on the side of the aisle that is like, yeah, I just don't think volume. I think the effects of volume have been overstated, and those are very cordial, and respectful conversations, and we look forward to feedback, and that's ultimately what the goal is of this sort of format, is not only helping lifters and enthusiasts and coaches, but also hopefully, adding something to the research in kind of a different format, if you will. So
my favorite comments are the ones where, whether directly or kind of indirectly through other conversation, we know people have a different perspective.
yeah, exactly.
But they take the time to say, hey, this looks awesome. Haven't got a chance to read it yet, but I'll let you know when I do. And that
Yeah.
just lets me know that they're going to give it the full consideration and take the time to really sit on it and come back with good
Yeah.
discussion points that, obviously we know this isn't a close and shut case, and
Yeah.
we're looking forward to, further in that discussion. So yeah, we got a lot of those, along with the the flaming takes within the 2 hours that the preprint was already up. So there's a good balance to it.
Yeah, we got a few messages that were like, "Hey, I hope the 2 hurricanes that hit you guys recently, everything is okay with those." And I'm working my way through the paper. I'll probably have some questions for you once I'm done, and that's fantastic. We look forward to it. And we hope that's the case for some of the other outcomes as well. So again, this is part 2 of 4 of the main outcomes, with some additional episodes kind of alongside those. There's just so much to discuss. And again, I just hope it came across in that first episode. I hope it comes across in this episode as well, that the goal is to provide transparency and not necessarily take sides. Near the end of the podcast, we are going to get into our perspective, our opinion, our takeaways, and our ultimately recommendations. But I think it's important to recognize that that's just that. And that is totally compatible with other perspectives as well, right? I hope that came across in the volume and hypertrophy one, that we are very, very open to this completely changing, right, in the future based on other learnings, whether it's the independent variables, so the training variable itself, right, volume or frequency, or the outcome variables, hypertrophy or strength. We learn something new about those that completely changes things, or maybe there's other statistical considerations that were blind spots for us. Again, I don't think that's the case, but hey, maybe it is.
Measurement stuff too. We were talking about that today already.
Yeah, measurement stuff. So again, going back to the dependent variables, and again, that's why I think this format is conducive to that, and I hope that comes across, because that is genuinely our goal. And I guess just to audit myself a little bit, there were some times in the 5-hour podcast when I listened back to it, I was like, I should have been even more hesitant there. So, again, I'm sure you could take any 30 seconds slightly out of context, and kind of reveal my bias. But I think by the end, my bias, like, I was pretty clear about our bias, our interpretation, but hopefully we acknowledged many different perspectives, and that's ultimately the goal, is to kind of give a hat tip to all those different perspectives, because different perspectives are cool. And
it's probably a nugget of truth to everything. I think that's ultimately like a big takeaway I've had from this project in general is, like, definitely came in with like my understanding of how this stuff was going to work and kind of what I expected to see, and I think that was shaped by conversations we've had, our understanding of everything. But I think kind of coming out the other side, I think I can at least better understand a lot of the different positions that kind of exist, and I think there's probably a kernel of truth to a lot of it.
Yep.
But the combination of all those things and consistently kind of trading those perspectives, I think, is what we ultimately need to keep pushing things forward. So yeah, I think the same thing will be with frequency here today.
Something that's just becoming more and more apparent to me is that different perspectives aren't mutually exclusive. if that makes sense. Like, say we theoretically knew the truth. There are various ways to kind of view that and implement it and communicate it to a general lifting audience. And I think in a lot of ways that is true for like volume, for example, or for frequency. A lot of different perspectives or just ways that you're kind of framing how you would apply these findings are not mutually exclusive, and they're very much compatible. Maybe you're just kind of like starting on one end and then walking back to the middle, as opposed to starting on the other end and then walking back to the middle. I just think in a lot of ways, a lot of you made this point in the volume podcast that if you were to just look at the total volume accrued over a calendar year for like different quote unquote camps, I have a hard time believing it's that systematically different. There's definitely going to be differences as a result of perspectives on these things, but man, I just think there's a lot of talking past people, to be honest, and I think a lot of different perspectives are compatible, and ultimately different perspectives are helpful, and I think hopefully that's coming across here.
Yeah, no, I agree with that 100%. I think another case where that's like abundantly clear to me is the frame of reference in which people are speaking. So like oftentimes I would say people that are more researchers, things like that come a little bit more from the scientific side of things, are often thinking about things in terms of like the meaningfulness of a difference, because I think you have just a better understanding of the various sources of it's various sources of variability, doesn't sound right, but the different ways that results can arise that are completely unrelated to the thing that we're actually trying to measure. And I think when you have a better understanding of that, it ultimately kind of pushes you more towards the side of like, okay, sure, there may be, a detectable effect here, but like, what are we talking about? What kind of the magnitude of a difference? And I think when you're speaking about it from that frame of reference and like relative to our smallest detectable effect size, things like that, you can come to a very, very, very different position than someone that's more from the lifter optimization. I will literally spend 6 hours in the gym to get 1% better kind of thing. I think you can come to very different positions on those things depending on the frame of reference there, which seems very minor, but it's not. Like, we could have a detectable effect that's really, really small, and to somebody who is literally just, optimal everything, that could be something that they take account of, whereas somebody else is like, yeah, dude, but like 3 times of the amount of time in the gym for something I probably can't even notice, like that doesn't seem reasonable. And so both of those are like valid perspectives, but because they don't have those grounding conversations initially to get all those presuppositions on the same page, that's where I think people just completely talk past one another, because they're like, hey, it's greater than 0. And he's like, I don't care. And nobody really meets each other in the middle.
Yeah, I think that's well said. And I think it's also just emphasizing different things. So like, I guess the way that I see it is, in a lot of ways with our podcast, we will mention like the big rocks of, progressive overload, consistency, outside of gym factors. But we probably don't emphasize those to the degree that would be most beneficial for like a general audience, right? Because I think it's a safe assumption that most people coming to this podcast are going to have a good appreciation for those. So we're kind of going multiple layers deeper than that. So someone might come and just emphasize things that we fully agree are very important, is just being consistent with your training. And yeah, if you're worried about, 8 fractional sets a week versus 16 fractional sets a week, but you're not consistent with your training in the first place, obviously that's the volume discussion is a moot point. So again, I think so many of these things are compatible with each other that, we've talked about this before. We still hold out hope that there's a utopia that everyone can get along and, just work together and be on the same team, and everyone will benefit as a result. And we can't make any promises, but we'll do what we can in that regard. Before we dive in here, I want to again give a massive shout out to our entire research team that contributed to the manuscript here. Jake Remmert, who again we look forward to having on here very soon, and he has a manuscript coming up shortly as well that has a good amount of overlap with today's podcast as well. So things we discussed today are going to be further discussed in that episode with Jake, in that manuscript with Jake, because we'll dive into that when the time comes. But shout out to Jake. Obviously, shout out to Zach. Shout out to Seth Hinson. Shout out to our advisor, Dr. Mike Zordas, or my advisor, your former advisor, because everyone was integral to this project. So we wouldn't have this manuscript without everyone involved. Okay. And another just caveat that we mentioned at the beginning of the volume discussion is that we're still discussing version 1 of the preprint. Now, technically, it's version 2 on Sport Archive because I messed up some of the formatting with the abstract on Sport Archive. So version 1 and version 2 on Sport Archive, the exact same thing. I just like pressed enter too many times. But essentially version 1 of the paper, as of recording this in October of 2024, there may be additional versions of the preprint, and there may even be additional versions beyond that before publication. So just wanted to mention that as a disclaimer on the front end. And hey, at the end of the day, I'm having a blast with our data set. In my biased opinion, this is kind of what I think to be the best look at some of these fundamental training questions that I've had and that others have speculated about, and now we can actually look at these relationships. So I'm looking forward to diving into specifically frequency's effect on hypertrophy today, and also some further discussion beyond that. Zach, anything to add there before we dive in to just a general background here on frequency's effect on hypertrophy?
I don't think so. Let's get into it.
Cool. So at the end of the day, the goal of this research project, and therefore the manuscript, is to meta-analyze the effects of resistance training dosage. And the primary way to manipulate dosage is volume. And this kind of assumes a certain efficiency of that dosage. So that's not to say you can just have unlimited volume training super far from failure. So hey, go look back at Zach's meta-analysis and meta-regressions on proximity to failure. But with a certain perspective, you could say that, hey, the number one way to adjust dosage is going to be volume. And then frequency kind of plays a secondary role, if you will, to manipulate dosage. And I think it kind of falls under that dosage bucket in some ways. Now, the specific question we're going to be diving into today is the independent role of frequency on hypertrophy. So, in other words, the goal is to understand, hey, at a given amount of volume, how do different frequencies, so different times a specific muscle is trained per week, how does that affect our measurements of muscle size? Just as a very basic example, if I'm doing 10 weekly sets, let's just say it's all direct training for my biceps, so 10 sets of bicep curls per week. Let's say they're all to failure. Does it matter if I do those all in one session, or do I get a benefit if I break it up into 5 and 5? Or maybe even if I break it up into, say, 5 sessions of 2 sets per session. That's basically the question we're double clicking on. And I think it's important to, again, emphasize that everything is in the context of being volume adjusted or volume equated, in the sense that there might be at the end of the day, no training variable operates in isolation. So this is, again, once you have everything else, controlled for, how do changes in frequency impact measures of muscle size, i.e. hypertrophy? So if we think about that research question and we think back, let's say over the last, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, something like that, similar to what we discussed in the volume podcast, various shifts have happened, whether it's in the literature itself, but also just kind of popularized through various science communication mediums, okay? And I think this is a good time to remind everyone that a lot of these shifts, in our view, might be due to a single study coming out that gets kind of discussed heavily. But again, it's really important to just understand research in general, that studies can report different things for many reasons. And we'll probably come back to this point multiple times, not only in this podcast, but in future podcasts. So at the end of the day, various factors can influence the findings you have for the same exact research question. Now, in the case of frequency, some of those factors could be the specific study design. It could be the training status of the participants. It could be the muscle group trained and therefore measured. It could be the weekly volumes used when looking at the effects of frequency, or various other training variables, right? Those absolutely may affect the effects of frequency. But even beyond that, if you had all those the same, there are many other sources of variability in research that can lead similar research questions or similar study designs to having different outcomes. These are the various sources of variability that Zach mentioned a little bit ago. The primary ones here being measurement error and sampling variability. We mentioned these a little bit more in the previous podcast on volume, and we could probably do a entire podcast on that in the future to really dive into that. But I think it's just important to keep that in mind, because you might hear a conclusion we have, but say, oh, we have this study from 2017 that disagrees with it. It's like, cool, but studies vary for many different reasons. And, you know, we'll probably get into this in the future. One perspective is, okay, we can craft a narrative by kind of picking and choosing various studies and their findings. Or not picking and choosing, but just identifying exactly how these studies align and try to craft a narrative that aligns. Our perspective is more so like, man, we're trying to find the general dose-response relationship, or the general nature of the relationship of this variable's effects on the outcome of interest, because that's probably the only shot we have.
It's not necessarily like, it's not saying that the other perspective of trying to find commonalities in study design and stuff like that, it's not to say that that's a wrong perspective. That absolutely can be a big factor. So just like, let's take a basic example. Let's say, I'm not saying this is accurate, but I'm just purely using this as a theoretical example. Let's say frequency did matter for lower body, but not upper body. And you only had, let's say 6 studies to pick from, 3 upper, 3 lower. You may look at those and be like, oh, that's the difference, right? But along with that difference, you have differences in exercise selection, you have differences in rep range, you have differences in sample size, you have differences in the intervention duration. Like, there's a bunch of differences alongside that lower and upper body kind of difference. And ultimately, what you're banking on is that this kind of vote counting difference that you're picking up on, which very well may be a thing, is something that outweighs all these other potential sources of variation, which, if you hear me say that, you say, well, we should probably try to do that in as rigorous of a manner as possible. And that's why meta-analysis is useful in the first place, right? Is we identify all of these potential sources of variation and try to systematically look at those while accounting for all these other potential effect modifiers, and say, are any of these consistent enough to be kind of noteworthy? And that's kind of leads us back to why these things are important in the first place, because without doing it that way, there are, again, all these other things you may not think of that could be very well explaining that variation, independent of the factor that you think is really driving that effect. And so, you can't just pick and choose certain studies. You got to put all these studies together to see, okay, is it the fact that these 3 studies differ in upper lower body, or is if we use all 60 studies, is that just a minuscule portion of all this when we actually account for all this other stuff? So it's not to say that that's not a good way of going about it. I think we've just landed on that because after having done this basically 3 or 4 times now, those moderating variables usually aren't the thing that's driving that variation, particularly given our experience in the lab.
And I think some people's eyes might kind of glaze over this conversation, which I understand. It's not the most exciting point to double click on, is just all the sources of variability in research. But I find it very interesting these days. Now, we're probably just unique in that sense because of our, roles in research these days. But B, it is just absolutely vital to science communication and as a consumer of science communication. I can't remember how many different pills are there. I know there's red pill, blue pill, black pill. What else is there?
He said red pill first, folks.
I genuinely don't really understand what that's talking about. I know it's related to. I'm gonna get in trouble. What movie is it from? The Matrix, right?
Yeah.
So I'm generally familiar with it. You can fill in whichever pill this is, but your perspective really changes not only when you just get experience with research, but also when you understand that most studies, even if they show that there's no statistical difference, you also should really be testing whether you can have statistical confidence, for lack of a better phrase, that they are equivalent. So not only should you be testing for the potential differences between the groups, but you should be testing for the equivalence of the group, or of the groups plural. And a lot of studies are just simply inconclusive. Now, a lot of people just aren't aware of that, and I just think that totally, whatever pill that is, once you take that, just totally changes your frame of reference when you try to kind of, again, piece together a narrative from individual studies. Now, again, hypothesis generating, absolutely, let's do it. Let's look at, okay, this study was a little bit different. Why is that the case? Okay, let's test that. But again, I just think this point is so important, and I'll shut up about it I'll shut up about it now unless you have anything to add, Zach.
No, that's a good point, and yeah, just understanding those things about individual studies, I think, help to just frame the fact that these types of projects are helpful when we're trying to make these recommendations and kind of, okay, how are we going to go about our training from now on?
Yeah,
so that's where it's useful.
And okay, we're probably presenting this point from the point of, therefore, some things that don't matter even in a meta-analysis never matter. Like, someone could conflate that. So we're making the point that, okay, you can have a finding in a meta-analysis, and that's probably going to be a little bit more reliable from a large-scale nature of the relationship. But you also, so we just made that point. We're also acknowledging the fact that you could have a meta-analytic finding, but the application, or maybe it does actually matter in other scenarios that are uniquely different from the context of the meta-analysis, right? So those are things we're gonna dive into.
Just to make sure it's crystal clear, you're basically, I'll put timestamps so people can skip this fast, but you're basically just saying that, like, while meta-analysis is obviously a very, very powerful tool in the sense that it actually allows us to have a decent degree of confidence in the findings because the precision is much better than an individual study. At the same time, in order to account for all these differences in study design and things like that, that can be very important on an application level, it's challenging, and it's usually our best guess and not super direct, right? So that's the fine balance of, first and foremost, doing meta-analysis is very challenging, and trying to particularly do it in a way that acknowledges all these different potential moderating factors that, a Instagram comment that we get when the preprint's posted, when it's like, well, yeah, but you didn't account for proximity to failure. It's like, oh man, like, like, come on. And like, those are the gut instinct of a lot of people that are viewing research. So that type of stuff is really important to acknowledge, but it's really challenging to do. It's challenging to code all those different variables and, like, what's the best way to approach this. So yeah, it's challenging. So there's absolutely applications of individual studies that have some pros that meta-analysis doesn't, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's another.
It's almost just like, once you get to the super nitty-gritty questions of, like, okay, we see this relationship, but what happens if this is the case? Sure, we could design a study to specifically answer that, but we just discussed how you really need either a very well-powered study or multiple studies. It really leads to the conclusion of, like, we can't answer very specific questions with our current resources. So therefore, that leads us to projects like this to generally understand the nature of the relationship, and that just leaves the door open for so many different practical solutions for coaches or lifters to kind of make with this knowledge and uncertainty.
I'll put a bow on it with this, and then we can move on. But I think probably I should rephrase what I said to say there's pros and cons to each meta-analysis, and high-powered, well-designed studies that target something. When you're dealing with small sample, poorly powered studies, those are where it's challenging to have these answers to very specific questions that people have a desire to know. But then that's more of like an epistemic question of what is research for, and that's a entirely different rabbit hole that we'll skip for now. But if we want to head back into kind of some just general background information on kind of the frequency research,
and stay tuned, because we're going to give you a nice visual at the end of the podcast showing the effects of frequency for each individual outcome from each study, which does a nice job of kind of displaying some degree of variability there. And ultimately, that tangent, which hopefully at least two people enjoyed or benefited from, that is ultimately because I was making the point that shifts have happened over time, at least from my perspective, for the effects of frequency on hypertrophy. When I started lifting, so I've been lifting for about 10 years. To me, my perspective at the time was that bro splits were kind of the default, if you will. Like, that was just the way you train, right? You have a chest day, you have a back day. I can't even remember exactly what a typical bro split is, but I think most people know generally what those are. And then shortly after starting to lift regularly, I was exposed to the concept of higher frequencies. So put simply, training each muscle more than one time per week. And my perspective at the time was, oh, this is the sciencey way to train. I've always kind of viewed higher frequencies as a little bit more sciencey. Is that aligned with your perspective?
100%.
Okay.
Like bro splits are something that
The bros do.
Yeah, I would say anybody going in a gym that seems to be moderately consistent and cares about it a decent amount, I'd say there's a pretty high probability that's what they're doing. And then anyone
Especially
that's,
like 10 years ago.
yeah, absolutely. And then anyone that's training, you see them doing like one of the barbell movements like more than once a week. I think that's like an immediate signifier, like, oh, this guy,
Science based.
is like kind of keyed in.
Yeah. And to be clear, I'm not using the phrase sciencey in like a good way or a bad way. Hey,
I saw some really funny memes in the past couple weeks about like it was just kind of like comparing and contrasting like training in the 90s versus now. And dude, there's a modicum of truth to it. Yeah. It's pretty funny.
Yeah. So, okay, why might higher frequencies be better from kind of this sciencey perspective? I think a really good example of this, and this leads us to the very first visual in this multimedia experience, a really nice paper that describes the potential rationale for higher frequencies being beneficial at a given volume is a narrative review by Dankel and colleagues from 2017. I want to be very clear, this study is, at this point, 7+ years old, so I'm not necessarily saying that these authors still hold this opinion. There's things we put out last year that I'm like, I'd say that differently, So I just think this is a really good example of just the general concept of why higher frequencies might be theoretically better in kind of that sciencey perspective, if you will. I'll also say that at the time, some of the preliminary evidence we had did report some slight beneficial effects of frequency. I think it was 2015 or 2016. There was a meta-analysis on frequency by Schoenfeld and colleagues that did report a potential slight benefit of higher frequencies. We're going to discuss a 2019 frequency meta-analysis from the same group that used more data. So we're going to kind of focus on that because it's basically the same thing, just more data a few years later. But nonetheless, at the time, I think probably the scientific community was a little bit on the, frequency seems like a really good idea, and we maybe have some indications from individual training studies that higher frequencies are going to be better. So this is figure 1A from that Dankel paper. And in the top panel, this is figure 1, and then the top panel is figure 1A. If you want to pause this and read the caption, be our guest. But basically the idea here is that there is going to be muscle anabolism that occurs after each training session, okay? And basically this model here relies on the fact that there is an anabolic limit to each session. So if you do, their example here is training 2 days a week with 9 sets per muscle group, right? If there's no volume threshold and you just kind of see a linear per session dose response relationship of additional sets, sure, you might get just as much area under the curve in terms of anabolism throughout the week as if you were to break those same, that would be 18 sets, if you were to break that volume up over multiple sessions. But what they're demonstrating here is, hey, if there is this anabolic limit, so an amount that you can benefit from in terms of muscle hypertrophy from a given session, then those would effectively be wasted sets at whatever point you get above that anabolic limit. And again, last time I read this paper, I didn't necessarily get the sense that they're saying this is definitely true. You'll see figures like this in research just kind of demonstrating a concept of, hey, we should test this. So that's kind of how I view this. And then, Zach, if you scroll down a little bit to figure 1B, you can see that area under the curve kind of demonstrated, right? So the area under the curve for basically the various per session volume and frequency approaches, it's going to be higher if you break up that 18 sets over multiple sessions, right? So this is the very basic idea, is that, hey, if there's kind of this anabolic limit or if there's this anabolic limit or a maximum amount that we can benefit from one given session, it makes sense to just go ahead and break that work up over more sessions. And that's especially the case for trained people. And that largely comes from the muscle protein synthesis research. Two caveats on the front end. The first is that it's just probably muscle protein synthesis is likely not a very good indicator of muscle growth in general. And the second caveat is I've never directly studied muscle protein synthesis. I've never actually done those measurements, so I'm far from an expert on them. So with those two caveats out of the way, what I will say about the muscle protein synthesis research is that we do see this general relationship in that trained folks experience muscle protein synthesis for less total time after a given session. So the idea is, okay, if a trained person benefits from the training for, let's say, don't read too much into this number, but let's say 48 hours after the training session, we can just go ahead and do that next session because we're ready to rock. We're no longer anabolic. Let's just go ahead and hit that next session. And especially if you pair that with the fact that there might be an anabolic limit per session, then okay, it definitely makes sense to break your volume up over multiple sessions. So I think in this 2016, 2017 range, maybe even 2019, before we get to the next meta-analysis that came out, there was probably a leaning in the higher frequency direction. Would you tend to agree, Zach?
Yeah, I think so. I think that was basically the common narrative is that, okay, muscle growth is essentially the net protein balance from muscle protein synthetic signaling pathways, and then those that break down muscle protein, and then essentially the net result of that is kind of your net protein balance in the state of hypertrophy or atrophy that you're in. And if trained lifters are essentially seeing shorter term elevations in MPS following a training bout, essentially we need to hit that muscle more frequently in order to rack up this kind of net gain that we're trying to accrue over the course of a week. Now, as you said, we are neither of us are in the lab experts on MPS, which is definitely something I'd like to do a future episode on and just kind of talk about all these different molecular measurements because we're familiar with kind of the gross ones like muscle size and strength and things like that. But understanding some of the behind the scenes stuff on that, I think would give you even better indications on some of this stuff. But there's just like a lot of different questions I have on that line of reasoning. I don't know how many pit stops you want to make along the way before you kind of build the case here, but yeah, that definitely was my kind of perception of the general chatter on this and how we kind of arrived at, yeah, like I think higher frequency is probably a good approach for these kind of logical reasons, which I think at face value make perfect sense.
Yeah, I think that's probably sufficient for now. We'll probably circle back to a little bit more nuance or a little bit more depth around some of those potential effects, not only later in this podcast, but when we have Jake on for the per session volume discussion. Because that his manuscript, I'll hold off on discussing it specifically, but more to come on that. But I think that hopefully generally makes sense. I remember there was a time where there was just a lot of content around full body training. I just did a quick search on the YouTubes. It looks like that peaked around 2019 to 2020, which is a little bit later than I thought based on the timing of this research here. But nonetheless, there was, I distinctly remember kind of a high frequency trend, if you will. And that leads me to a meta-analysis in 2019 by Schoenfeld and colleagues. And there was a lot of research published between the years of 2016 and 2019. Okay. So this was the first, I would say, just kind of subjectively speaking here, that this is the first solidly powered frequency meta-analysis. And to summarize the results from a high level, there was no clear benefit of frequency on a volume equated basis. So what we have here is figure 2A from that 2019 meta-analysis from Schoenfeld and colleagues. On the left-hand side, you have the forest plot of all of the volume equated studies. And then on the right-hand side here, you have what's called a posterior distribution plot of those same exact studies. So this is the same data just shown in a slightly different way. Then, Zach, if you go to the next figure, this is figure 3A and figure 3B, you again have a forest plot on the left-hand side and a posterior distribution on the right-hand side. Again, these are all volume-equated studies, but these are only direct measurement modalities. So it wouldn't include something like DEXA, for example. So these are generally thought to be more sensitive to subtle changes in muscle size. So this is probably what we would put the most stock in is figure 3A and figure 3B right here. And you can see that there's no clear, consistent benefit to higher frequencies. But Zach, maybe you want to add some color here, because my takeaway from this at the time and when I revisit it is that there might be something there still, especially given some of the limitations of kind of looking at it in this binary fashion of low frequencies versus higher frequencies. For example, I didn't write down the point estimate from the forest plot here in figure 3A, but nonetheless, I believe it's slightly positive. So from a high level, okay, no clear, consistent effect of lower versus higher frequencies, but point estimate's a little bit positive. There's a lot of different ways to look at this question, so I always thought, hey, there might be something there that we need more research on, but what do you think?
Yeah, I think I agree. I think ultimately there's a few things about this plot that are kind of deceptive at face value. I think the line on the left initially looks like it's at 0, but I think it's the mean effect size throughout all the other effect size, so it makes the majority of the effects look like it's to the left of 0.
Yeah, the dotted line isn't over 0 like most forest plots.
Yeah. So
it's over the mean effect, which I guess that's an interesting approach. But I think the point estimate was like, don't quote me on this, but I'm recalling from the paper now, I think it was 0.07.
Looks right so the middle of the posterior should be roughly. Yeah, it's close to. I think it might even be over 0.1 for the direct effects at least.
I will see if I can. I remember my citation manager did not retrieve this full text, so while you're talking, I'll see if I can pull it up. But we'll see.
But yeah, ultimately, I think I definitely didn't think about this in a robust way at the time by any means, but I think there's a few things that come to mind here that when you're like looking at this and kind of thinking about it, how it could be potentially understating the effects a little bit. So when you look at the outcomes on the left, some of them are greater than others, and some of them are to the left of the mean relative to the others. And the ultimate question, and why we kind of, again, just to hammer home kind of the methods discussion we did in the last episode of the podcast, one of the reasons that this probably can be taken a step further and evolved is that you just don't know the frequencies that are occurring in each one of those comparisons, and ultimately the difference in frequency. So just as a conceptual example, let's say the larger effects had a larger difference in frequency and the smaller effects had a smaller difference in frequency. That fundamental aspect of things is how you are better able to inform the kind of the dose response relationship and how that looks. And then ultimately, is there some sort of nonlinearity that's occurring there where very low frequencies are maybe worse than moderate frequencies, but moderate isn't better than high? You don't really know, and you just can't really answer that question. So that's where I think I interpret it in hindsight very similar to kind of how you did, is in the sense that, oh, it's interesting. It's to the right of 0 relative to the other meta-analyses. There's not a ton of effects for direct comparisons of hypertrophy. We don't really know the frequencies and the differences in frequencies that were explored here. So it's one of those things where I say, oh, that's interesting. Definitely something to kind of keep in my mind. If it was a really large effect, you would expect that probably would have been detected. But if you're interpreting this in kind of a Bayesian approach, as the posterior distribution is going to suggest, the majority of the posterior distribution is positive. So if you are interpreting that in terms of a hedge your bets kind of an approach, again, this is exactly where I'm talking about that kind of frame of reference can very quickly change depending on who you're talking to. If I'm interpreting this as a researcher and more of a traditional lens of interpretation, this isn't 100% consistent with an effect, which, given all the limitations of measurements and things like that, typically would kind of view that as kind of a null finding, or something that I wouldn't put a ton of stock into of being an effect that we should necessarily expect to be there. But from a practitioner's lens of things, often who have to think about the cost-benefit analysis to any one of these decisions, I very much think it's a reasonable interpretation to say this seems to have a neutral to positive effect.
Yeah.
Definitely there's some posterior mass that's on the left of 0, so it's not saying it's like completely devoid of a negative effect, but conceptually I would say neutral to positive effect here, maybe something to experiment with, but not something that's likely to be massive. So I think I'm very much in line with kind of how you're interpreting things.
Cool. And then the next figure actually is another analysis they did in this paper with the same extracted data set. This is table 2, and they did what's called a categorical meta-regression. And you can look at the effect size estimates, whether that is a standardized mean difference or as a percentage gain. And I would especially focus on the right-hand side there, the volume-equated studies with direct measurements only. So that's going to be basically just another look at figure 3 that we were just looking at, but again, just a slightly different way at looking at it. So this isn't the way that we would necessarily try to look at a continuous relationship, but it is a way to attempt to look at a continuous relationship. So they probably acknowledge, okay, some of the studies in figure 3 compared 1 versus 2, some compare 1 versus 2 times per week, some compared 1 versus 6. That's not necessarily a super granular way to look at the question. So let's instead kind of look at this categorical meta-regression. So I think you could definitely overinterpret this and say that, hey, 3 days per week had the largest effect estimate, whether that's in terms of percentage gain or standardized mean difference. But ultimately, the effective frequency was not significant here. So there's a lot of noise here. At the time, I think it was less than 10 studies that met this criteria of being volume equated and having direct measurements only. And there's no super consistent effect. But again, I remember looking back at this or reading this a few years ago, and when I returned to it, I'm like, man, I just have a lot of questions here in terms of what does that continuous dose-response relationship look like if we test various relationships, just like we did for the effects of volume on hypertrophy. So as we'll get to in the methods, basically what we did for our project here is we fit the data to 7 different potential functional forms of a dose-response relationship, whether that's linear, linear log, etc., and basically saw which one was the most likely to be true, and that's what we're going to get into in a second. But ultimately, in 2019, as a result of this analysis being published, I think the pendulum, I don't want to say it swung towards everyone training 1 time a week, but just saying, hey, there doesn't seem to be a consistent effect of frequency, and maybe some of the hype we saw in previous years was not necessarily the most accurate thing in the world.
Yeah, 100%. I totally agree with that.
Cool. The final thing I'll say regarding these shifts is, hey, that was published in 2019. Now it's 2024 last time I checked. And we are due for, I think, an updated meta-analysis, potentially with some alternative methods that might give us some additional insights. And that's ultimately what we aim to do here. But beyond any published meta-analyses, I think there has been a recent shift just in the general science communication sphere more towards, or kind of, I should say, back towards the higher frequency side of things. That's at least my perspective. I absolutely do not claim to understand the happenings going on the internet. I try to stay off of that place as much as I possibly can. But like, for example, before and especially after our manuscript was posted on Sport Archive, the preprint server, I've gotten some questions about kind of this first sets concept. So from my perspective, again, take this with a grain of salt because it's probably not the best analysis of the happenings, but I've definitely seen, at least to some degree, a shift back towards the higher frequency side of things, potentially for some of those similar reasons as what Dankel and colleagues noted in 2017, and some other ones that I think we'll get into at the end of the show.
Yeah, I would agree. I also try to stay away from the brain rot as much as possible, but I think that's probably pretty accurate for a variety of different reasons that I'm sure we'll touch on.
Yeah. So I guess from a high level, ultimately, there's been a ton of helpful, insightful, informative work in the area of the effects of frequency independent of volume on muscle hypertrophy. And obviously there's been individual training studies that have occurred up to this point. And shout out to all of the researchers that go and do those training studies, because we know that those are no joke to do. So ultimately, I think we're due for an update. And our perspective, and hopefully what we can add, is looking at the continuous relationship, as we discussed with the podcast on the effects of volume on hypertrophy. So in other words, okay, if we kind of put it all together, compare it binarily between low frequencies and high frequencies, maybe we do or don't see an effect, but that's not really the question we have. We're not making a question for training of low versus high frequency. we can choose really any frequency, right? So that, in addition to some other methodological decisions, we wanted to get the best insights possible from the available data on the effects of on some of these frequency choices you might want to make. Again, with a pretty dang practical lens, especially once we discuss our inclusion criteria and the methods we used.
Yep.
Cool.
Money.
All right. So that's more or less the background. So at this point, we can discuss what we did and ultimately what we found. But before we get to what we found, we got to discuss what we did, because methods are very, very important, and I think help frame the results quite a bit. The first thing we did is we distinguished between direct and indirect sets. This is basically the exact same approach we took with the volume analysis. So my understanding of the methods from previous meta-analyses on frequency is that anytime you trained a muscle in any way, so the easiest example is let's say you're measuring biceps hypertrophy. If you did bicep curls on Monday and lat pull downs on Thursday, that would be a frequency of 2. So there's no distinguishing between a direct set, like bicep curls for the biceps, and an indirect set, like lat pull downs or rows for the biceps. Now, it's understandable why that's the case. It's quite difficult to, or not difficult, but it's just tricky to make some of those decisions of how exactly to go about that. So part of what we wanted to do is to explore some alternative approaches to quantifying frequency. So again, step one is saying, okay, in every single exercise performed in all of the studies included in our meta-analysis, we need to make consistent decisions regarding what is considered direct and what is considered indirect. So basically, a direct set was any time that the measured muscle was likely to be the primary force generator for that exercise. And then an indirect set for a given muscle is any time that muscle was likely to contribute meaningfully, but not be the primary force generator. Another way to think about that is kind of the limiting factor of the exercise. That's a little bit less scientific and it's kind of hard to prove. But hey, if the muscle was more likely to be the limiting factor, it was more likely, then it was going to be the count as a direct exposure in this case. If it was involved but not the limiting factor, it was an indirect exposure. So Zach, one of the next figures is table 1A from the manuscript. Again, this is version 1 of the preprint, and you can see some of these decisions. This is the exact same table we displayed for the volume podcast. So to circle back to our example of, biceps trained with bicep curls on Monday and then lat pull downs on Thursday, previous meta-analyses would have counted that as a frequency of 2. Okay. Instead, what we did is we did that approach, but we also did 2 more approaches. So ultimately, we had 3 classifications of frequency. We had total, fractional, and direct. So let me briefly explain both of those, or all 3 of those. Total is the exact same way that previous meta-analyses have done it. So that is any meaningful exposure to training for the measured muscle, it's going to count. So in our example, that would be a frequency of 2 for the biceps. The second one is fractional. So anytime the muscle was trained directly, that counts as one exposure. And if it's trained only indirectly, then that counts as half. So in our example, that would be a frequency of 1.5 in terms of our fractional quantification method. And then lastly, we also looked at direct frequency. So frequency was only counted, or it was only counted as an exposure if the muscle was trained directly. So in our example of bicep curls on Monday, lat pull downs on Thursday, that would only be a frequency of 1 because the muscle was only trained once that week. And again, that is not a wholly objective process of identifying those things, but we wanted to explore it. And hey, we saw the exact same methods that previous analyses have used, so it's still there, but we wanted to see, hey, can we potentially provide evidence of a better way to quantify, in this case, frequency? So if you want to dive into that table, you definitely can, but hopefully it's relatively intuitive with that explanation. Okay, with that, we can move into our inclusion criteria, because I know this kind of sounds like a snooze fest, maybe it is, but it's important, and there's some important things to point out here regarding the studies that we deemed eligible for inclusion that are different from previous meta-analyses, specifically that Schoenfeld 2019 meta-analysis, which we think, which I'm not necessarily making a value statement about, right, in terms of which is a better or worse choice. There are choices that each research team has to make, and it's also an easier decision to make in 2023/2024 compared to 2018/2019 when there's just less data. So for the manuscript as a whole, we extracted 67 total studies, but for our purposes here, only 35 of those would apply because only 35 of them had hypertrophy outcomes. So for hypertrophy specifically, the studies had to include a randomized design using either a within or between participants approach. It had to use dynamic resistance training, so it had to include an eccentric contraction and a concentric contraction, and the study had to last at least 4 weeks. Each study had to manipulate volume and or frequency. Each study had to equate the load. So, if one group was training with sets of 20, the other group was training with sets of 8, that study could not be included. They had to be equated for repetition range / load. And importantly, studies also had to be equated for proximity to failure, okay? And this is an important one to pause on here quickly because this is a consideration when discussing frequency, not only in practice, but also from a research perspective, is that as you do more and more sets in a workout, you're going to become more and more fatigued. And therefore, performance is going to kind of drop off. So that is one theoretical or potential benefit of higher frequencies is that, okay, instead of doing sets 6 through 10 in one workout, let's just move it later in the week so that I can perform better. We only included studies that seemed to take advantage of the higher frequency. So just to paint a basic example, let's say study A compared 10 sets in session 1 versus 5 and 5 in sessions 1 and 2. Okay? And in study A, they made the higher frequency group match volume load, or basically hold them back in terms of how much they're lifting in the higher frequency group in the second session. Compare that to study B. Let's say they're also comparing 10 sets once a week versus 5 sets twice a week. Study B says, hey, you guys are training with higher frequency. Take advantage of that. Still train to failure or at the desired RAR, and take advantage of the fact that you feel better for sets 6 through 10 because they're later in the week on a separate session, right? So because we only included studies that equated for proximity to failure, we aimed to only include studies that allowed the higher frequency advantage in that sense to be accounted for. And therefore, there should be an advantage to higher frequencies if that theoretical benefit does play out in terms of actual hypertrophy measurements. Now, I'll also caveat that in the sense that it's not always entirely clear with reporting in exercise science. We reached out to authors the best we could in our extracted data Excel file. We had a column for the progression approach and exactly what they said. And my subjective perspective is most of the studies were pretty clear in that the higher frequency group had that progression advantage. But some were borderline, and ultimately us as a research team had to make a decision, should we include it or not? So there's a lot of discussion that goes on in that sense. So is it perfectly accounted for in the sense that the higher frequency groups were able to properly take advantage of the inherent benefit of higher frequencies? Is it perfectly accounted for? I can't say, but that was at least our aim, is ultimately how I would view it. Zach, and actually I'll bring up the Nevis study in particular. So there's a really nice study from Nevis and colleagues, I think it was 2022 or some recent year. They basically had 4 groups. So they had low frequency, high frequency, but in those 2 groups, the higher frequency group had to basically have a constrained progression so that their volume load was similar to the low frequency group. Then the other 2 groups were also low frequency, high frequency, and the high frequency group was able to have flexible progression, meaning they were able to take advantage of that theoretical benefit I was just explaining. In the Nevis study, that study was included, but only the 2 groups that had the inherent benefit of the flexible progression. Does that paint the picture?
Yeah, 100%. Essentially, what you're coming down to is that the studies were set volume equated,
Yes.
not volume load equated. And volume load is just sets times reps times weight performed because, as Josh said, again, just triple clarifying, higher frequency approach. If you normally bench 100 pounds for 10 reps on Monday, and by the end of your sixth set, you're benching 60 pounds for 10. If you were to do sets 3 through 6 on Thursday, you could probably get closer to 100 pounds again. Yep. And so your volume load would end up being higher. So ultimately, that's the slight distinction there, is that we only included the studies that allowed volume load to be different between frequency conditions, which is one of the theoretical benefits. So yeah. 100%.
Yep, cool. Next inclusion criteria that's important to point out is that we only included studies that had a direct site-specific measurement of hypertrophy. So ultrasound and MRI were the most common methods for measuring muscle size or for measuring muscle hypertrophy. And that is slightly different from the Schoenfeld meta-analysis because they had indirect measurements as well, but they had some analyses where they only included the direct ones. But at this point, I think I'm pretty comfortable saying, hey, I really just want to look at the direct site-specific measurements of hypertrophy. We also did not include any studies that had any participants older than 70 years old, which is also different from the Schoenfeld meta-analysis because there were at least a handful of studies off the top of my head that were in older adults, which I think I mentioned this in the last podcast as well, may or may not be an advantage or a disadvantage. But in this case, we realize most people that are going to be applying these findings are probably young or middle age, and therefore we kind of just kept the inclusion criteria a little bit tighter in that sense. So the average age, I think, ended up being like 25 years old, whereas in previous meta-analyses, it was probably quite a bit higher than that. Cool. Next, let's discuss the approach to looking at the research question of the effects of frequency on hypertrophy, and specifically the primary analysis that we did, which is a multi-level meta-regression. If you want to really dive into what that is and some of the decisions that go into that, check out the last podcast because we spent a lot of time discussing that. So more or less everything we discussed there will apply here, but I think it's useful to give a high-level overview of the approach here. It's important to point out with this approach of a multi-level meta-regression, because of the multi-level nature of it, that effectively allows us to create a dose-response continuous relationship. So in this case, from a frequency of 0 per week to a frequency of 6 times per week, by focusing on within study, between group effects. And part of what you have to account for in order to do that are some variables that might systematically differ between studies. So as a result, we had 3 important fixed effects in the main model here, and that is training status, so whether the study used trained versus untrained participants, study duration, so if a study was 6 weeks long versus 16 weeks long, that was accounted for within the model, and also for the effects of frequency, it was adjusted for the effects of volume, right? We saw a dose-response relationship between volume and hypertrophy. So if we are plotting many different, or if we're looking for the independent effects of frequency, we want to create or include a fixed effect for volume to ensure that we are isolating the effect of frequency. And ultimately, as I alluded to before, with those fixed effects, with this multi-level approach, we tested 7 different models to see which performed the best. To see those 7 different model types listed out, you can refer to the manuscript. And ultimately, when we are testing those 7 different model types, we are looking for or I should say the computer, the statistical software, is looking for a balance between describing the underlying data very well, but also what's called parsimony, or just simplicity of the data. So if you were to fully lean into just describing the data the absolute best you can, you would get a really squiggly line that like perfectly adheres to every single data point, which obviously is not the case. So that also needs to be balanced with parsimony, or just the likelihood that this is an actual reasonable physiological relationship that we might see in physiology or in biology. Zach, anything to add on our multi-level meta-regression approach?
No, I think that overall covers it really well, and I'll make sure to link the lengthy discussion and visuals from the last episode kind of in this section in the timestamps. So you can refer to that if you really want the super mega deep dive. The one interesting thing I think about this is just kind of talking through maybe the volume adjustment a little bit more, in the sense that one additional thing here, and this kind of was the case with the rest interval discussion in the last episode. If you're just thinking about things purely logistically, studies that have higher frequencies, by nature of that design, typically what you're going to do is also have higher volumes. And so without that volume adjustment, there are some just potential confounding effects there from the fact that higher frequency studies also tend to be higher volume studies. And if you're not, like you said, perfectly isolating those effects from frequency directly and volume directly, you could be missing the boat there a little bit. And so that was something that was pretty important to kind of think through throughout this process, because of the fact that we knew from the kind of the primary portion of this project when we set out was that volume was going to have a pretty consistently identifiable relationship with hypertrophy in particular. And so making sure that we're doing that for the frequency studies. And I think that's just important to note, because I think, again, we talked about this in the other episode, but when we're including studies that both manipulated frequency, but also studies that manipulated volume to inform the overall frequency model, I think that's just important to kind of think through how can you do that. And I think, again, we talked about this in the other episode, but it's just good to reiterate here, particularly because I think the concern would be for this project rather than vice versa, theoretically.
For the frequency outcomes and less so for the volume outcomes.
Yeah, because you know, from previous work, we know that the effective volume is going to be more consistently identifiable than frequency.
And to be clear, Zach is just saying, like, there is some sort of dose-response relationship. It's not that we are assuming it's just this insane dose-response relationship. It's just saying, hey, intuitively, from previous research, we know that there's going to be some sort of dose-response relationship. We need to account for that. It's less likely to matter as much for the effects of volume because frequency has been less identifiable. But it's important to point out that we also included a frequency adjustment in the volume analysis, right? So, in other words,
which matters particularly for strength, which obviously we're not talking about in this episode, but it's the same logic.
Exactly. So I just want to make sure it's clear that was not our perspective or our like necessarily a decision we made based on our opinion about the effects of one variable, but instead it was just saying, hey, we have a data set of studies that manipulated volume and or frequency. One approach is to, if we're looking at the effects of frequency, is to only look at the studies that manipulated just frequency, which we did, which I'll get to in a second. And these are our secondary analyses, because that is an approach that we want to pay credence to, because it is a good approach. But what we think is an even better approach, especially in our field, without just a ton of underlying data, is to combine direct and indirect effects. So, hey, we have this data set with volume studies as well in the case of frequency. So let's include that in the model. If appropriately accounted for, it should only add precision to the model. So again, I just want to be clear that, basically everything we discussed regarding the volume meta-regression and how we accounted for frequency studies being present there applies here. It's just inverse, right? And again, we also looked at the quote-unquote pure approach of saying, hey, we're only going to look at direct studies on the topic in these secondary analyses. And just to briefly describe those secondary analyses, the way that we view them is largely confirmatory of the primary meta-regressions. And again, someone might value those more. Awesome. They're there for you. If you want them, we're going to discuss both. The first secondary analysis we did is just a kind of a traditional, what's called a contrast-based meta-analysis, which basically just compares higher versus lower frequencies. And similar to figure 3 from the Schoenfeld paper we showed a little bit ago, where does that pooled point estimate land, right? Do we generally see a benefit of higher or lower frequencies, or no difference? The second secondary analysis we did, so perhaps the tertiary analysis we did, is a 2-stage meta-regression. Again, same exact approach we outlined in the volume podcast. But basically, for each individual study, you identify, or the computer identifies, a linear slope for the effects of frequency, again, the independent effects of frequency, as well as an intercept, okay? And then these intercepts and slopes are meta-analyzed, and you can effectively get what's called, again, a 2-stage meta-regression for the effects of frequency on muscle hypertrophy only using the 15 studies that directly compared two different frequencies. So again, many different perspectives to how to go about these. We think the primary ones are best. That's why they're reported in the manuscript. They likely provide additional insight, but those secondary ones are a little bit more traditional, if you will, and they're there for you if you want. And again, we're going to discuss them as well here.
Yeah, money.
Cool. All right, with that, let's go into what we found. I think the first step here is to discuss the studies themselves, because at the end of the day, if you are, trying to make conclusions from a data set regarding a given variable, as we know with resistance training, different variables kind of depend on, or each training variable depends on other variables, right? Or at least that context is important to keep in mind. So the average study length for our entire data set was around 10.5 weeks on average, and a little more than half of the participants were trained compared to untrained. We'll discuss that trained versus untrained piece a little bit later in the interpretation. What's also important to identify, and you can see this on the screen right now, is that the average volumes for the included studies. So these are just for hypertrophy studies. The average volumes were about 13 sets per week. The average frequencies were about 2.33 sessions per week. The average rest period was right about 2 minutes per week. And the average number of repetitions per set was right around 10 reps per set. Okay, and you can see a density plot of that there. And then lastly, most studies, specifically about 79% of studies, included some sort of failure definition. So broad strokes here, most studies identified that, hey, the participants were turning to failure, whether that was a clear definition of momentary failure, which means, hey, if a repetition was completed, another repetition was attempted until they literally could not complete a repetition. Some also used different failure definitions like repetition maximum or 0 RAR, etc. So it's important to keep in mind that, hey, broad strokes, it seems like most of these studies included participants training to failure, but various definitions were used there, and we know that can have effects on the actual proximity to failure. So take that for what it's worth. About 30% of the studies had a clear definition of momentary failure. So I feel very confident that at least 30% truly trained to failure, and then the other 50% or so that had a failure definition, I feel relatively confident about. And then again, the final 20% clearly indicated they weren't trained to failure, or they had only some sets taken to failure. Anything to add there on the general study characteristics? Cool. We don't have necessarily a visual here of per session volumes, but you can kind of easily identify that by taking into account the fact that the average volumes were about 13 sets per week in terms of the fractional method of quantifying it. But the average frequency was a little over 2. So what you can see on the screen right now, whether you're watching on YouTube or you can see the video on Spotify, or if you're just listening, then bear with me and I'll try to describe it the best I can. Basically, what you have here is actually a density plot of sets per session. So I take back what I just said a second ago. So this is basically broken up by different frequencies. So at the top, we have the overall density plot of sets per session of hypertrophy studies. So for the most part, the sets per session were relatively low, I guess, just in my opinion. So that is the density plot at the top. You can see most of the per session volumes were definitely less than 10, and there were more common instances of per session volumes being less than 5 than there were in the 6 to 10 range, which is quite interesting. And then you can look at the blue, green, and red density plots as well for moderate, low, and high per session volumes, respectively. And kind of the general take-home I have from this is that in higher frequency studies, they were more likely to use lower per session volumes on average. And then studies investigating low frequencies tended to have slightly higher per session volumes, which makes intuitive sense if you're a researcher, an exercise scientist designing a training study. Okay, these participants are training once a week. I'm probably going to have them do a little bit more volume. And if they're training more frequently, probably going to have them do a little bit less volume. But that's just to give you a general idea of the per session volumes we're talking about here. At the end of the day, most are in the less than 10 sets per session range. And that'll be important as we dive into the interpretation. Just for completeness sake here, low volume or low frequency was identified as 1 session per week. Moderate, was that 2 to 3?
I believe so.
Yeah, I believe we identified moderate as 2 to 3, and high was 4 plus.
Yeah, I think it was less than 2, 2 to 3, or 2 to 4 maybe, and then 4 greater than or equal to 4. I think
Yeah,
and
to be clear, this figure is not in the manuscript or in the supplementary materials. As we were preparing for the podcast, we're like, hey, this would be helpful to include. So this is not the most scientific work in the sense that it's part of the manuscript or the supplementary materials, but just wanted to, again, provide a visual of per session volumes. My takeaway is that the per session volumes were quite manageable and quite reasonable for most folks. Okay, anything to add on kind of the study characteristics and therefore the context of the included studies?
Nope.
Okay, cool. Let's move into our findings. So let's start with the frequency quantification findings. So again, we compared the effects, or we compared the direct frequency method, the fractional frequency method, and the total frequency method, okay? And kind of the first step in this process, in my view, is testing which of those are most likely to represent the underlying data, okay? So the reasoning for this is, hey, we just intuitively know that frequency of direct versus indirect training, we're not really looking at the same thing there. So if we can account for that, then that's gonna add some validity to our results. So what you see here on this grid is that on the top, you have the numerator, and on the left-hand side, you have the denominator. And when you basically, compare the relative evidence for the numerator compared to the denominator, that creates what's called a Bayes factor for that comparison. So if you were to just look at the top left, if you were to compare the fractional method for frequency compared to the total method for frequency, the Bayes factor is 9.96, which indicates strong evidence in favor of the fractional method, or in favor of the numerator. So the TLDR from this grid here and from our findings is that the fractional method was quite a bit better at describing the underlying data compared to the more traditional approach of the total method and compared to the direct approach. Now, Zach, if you go to the next figure, this is included in the supplementary materials, but we also looked at this in a continuous fashion where we assumed the underlying model and basically compared the relative evidence for various ways of looking at the indirect set value. So as I described before, our fractional method counted indirect exposures as half of a frequency. So again, if you're measuring biceps and you do lat pull downs only in a day, that would count as half of a frequency. So in this case, we said, which is that 50% or is that half of a frequency accurate, or is it more likely to be closer to 25% or more likely to be closer to 75%? And as you can see here with the with kind of that solid blue line at the top, it didn't really matter all that much. There are some nitty-gritty details here to get into in terms of why that grid maybe indicated slightly stronger evidence compared to this continuous analysis. We could probably skip over that because that's, a 20-minute discussion that probably nobody cares about. But nonetheless, to me, this provides evidence that fractional is probably a bit better. Somewhere around 50% or a little bit more than that is probably going to be best. But at the end of the day, the goal of exploring these different frequency quantification methods is not to tell you exactly how to like count it in practice necessarily, but instead as an important first step to give us the best precision for modeling and understanding the dose response relationship. Because again, previous analyses, that is just a limitation, at least in our view. So we wanted to add that to the literature. So in short, going forward, we're going to be using the fractional quantification method, in which indirect exposures count as half of a frequency, and that'll kind of be our frame of reference going forward here. Anything to add, Zach?
Yeah, I think ultimately the way that I view these, and again I talked about this in the volume one as well, is that it's just communicating that indirect sets are likely contributing some stimulus to the training effect, rather than absolutely zero or absolutely equivalent to a direct exposure. Right.
Yeah.
That's really, to me, at the end of the day, that's what these questions, or what these kind of model comparisons are kind of telling us. I wouldn't take it to the bank. As you said, I wouldn't automatically say that anybody's counting direct frequency is dumb. I don't think any of those are like intelligent ways to kind of go about utilizing these things. It's just to say, okay, given some of these assumptions, which of the models that we fit is probably going to be the most representative of the kind of underlying physiological construct that we're trying to approximate. So I think that I just always like to be clear with these, that they're very much exploratory, and give kind of particularly the continuous one is just kind of idea fuel for future research, to say like, oh, okay, this is interesting. Frequency seems to be a little bit different than volume in terms of the way that these look. But again, I want to take them to the bank by any means.
And I'll also note that part of the reason that line that you're looking at right now, like there really aren't big differences throughout that continuous relationship of counting it an indirect exposure as 0, so the direct quantification, all the way up into 100, so that would effectively be the total quantification. Part of the reason it's not all that different is twofold. The first is that a lot of times the quantification methods were the exact same, whereas with volume, it was quite a bit different depending on how you, whether you did the direct, fractional, or total approach. Whereas for frequency, it did matter a few times. So, for example, if there was no direct bicep training in a study, but they measured bicep hypertrophy and that was the main outcome, we think that's pretty important to factor that into the overall dose-response relationship, or I should say that study's contribution to the overall dose-response relationship. But that was pretty infrequent, and a lot of times the frequencies were the exact same for total, fractional, and direct. The second reason, and we can go to the next figure here and discuss our primary meta-regression results. The second reason is that the effects of frequency just weren't all that strong. So let's break down what we are looking at here. So this is, again, our primary meta-regression looking at the independent effects of frequency in that fractional quantification method and its effects on changes in muscle size. So let's focus on panel A here to start. So that's on the left-hand side here. If you think back to the effects of volume, we saw a stronger dose-response relationship just visually, right? We saw that as you go from 0 sets per week up to 10 sets, 20 sets, etc., you see that it generally goes up. In this case, if you just look at that middle line there, right, that solid line that starts at 0, 0, you see that it goes up a bit, basically, from 0 to 1, which makes sense because you're going from the control adjustment effect at 0, at a frequency of 0. And then from 1 to 2, maybe it goes up a bit. And then from 2 and beyond, we more or less see this functional plateau. So ultimately, what we see here is not a super strong effect, but let's add a little bit of color to that. So the way that you kind of put some numbers on a meta-regression like this is to look at the slope of the relationship. Specifically, in this case, for a nonlinear dose-response relationship, what we did is we looked at the marginal slope, so the marginal linear slope at the average frequency. Okay, the average frequency was right around 2 sessions per week. So if you were to basically say, hey, what is the linear slope at about 2 sessions per week? That is basically what you see in panel B. Okay, so that linear slope is 0.32% for each additional session. Okay, So you might say, oh, there is a positive effect of frequency. And I would say, yeah, that's the way it slightly leans, is a slight positive effect for additional frequency at our average frequency of about 2 sessions per week. However, you also need to consider the uncertainty around that marginal slope. And that is basically the width of the diamond here. And you can see that the width of the diamond on the right-hand side crosses over 0. Okay, so the credible interval spanned from negative 0.14% all the way to 0.82%. So therefore, our results indicate that you can just think of it as the general effect of frequency from our data set, that effect is maybe slightly positive on average, but it's also very much compatible with negligible effects. And just for completeness sake, the best fit model approach here that is presented in panel A is what's called a reciprocal model best fit. And again, that basically indicates to us very strong diminishing returns, and those diminishing returns happen quite quickly. So that is a general overview of our primary meta-regression for the effects of frequency on hypertrophy. But I'll pause here and see what other color you think is worth adding.
Yeah, I think for the most part, you did a really good job. I think you can just, and I like what you did in terms of kind of visually talking about it in comparison to the volume one. I think that helps people kind of understand, because if you just saw this plot in isolation, I think the interpretation of it might have been substantially different. Like, in terms of, again, going back to kind of the frame of reference, I think this is just like something I want to hammer home is like, again, when we do these kind of projects and these bigger meta-analytic approaches that are supposed to give us as much statistical power as humanly possible. It's not to say we have a lot in an absolute sense. Still a few number of studies, a lot of variability that's unrelated to the training effects, etc. So, grand scheme of things, these aren't the most powered analyses in the world relative to other fields, but it's basically the best we can possibly do. And if we are trying to do that and we don't see a consistently identifiable effect, that should probably give you some pause in terms of, okay, I'm not going to run with a directional leaning in this case. Now, that said, there's still part of me that's a practitioner that needs to know from like a directional intervention approach, if I'm going to work with a client, which way am I going to kind of hedge my bets? And I think that's ultimately what we try to do here is appeal to both of those approaches, both in kind of what we reported with kind of some of the probabilities of, I saw some of the super cool hot takes within 6 hours of the preprint being posted. Those numbers, I think, one of the reasons we want the Bayesian framework is because it gives you access to those probabilities that I think are extremely intuitive. And I think I noticed people were hinging on those quite a bit and using that as kind of positive evidence, which I found interesting. But that's kind of the point here is that if you're doing things kind of quote unquote by the book from a scientific perspective, you're probably saying, hey, this slope is at least compatible with a negative slope. Hey, that probably shouldn't be something I should treat as a super serious effect. But if you're interpreting kind of the entire posterior distribution here, the majority of it is on the positive side of 0. So my best guess is it's probably compatible with a small positive effect of frequency. And that's just kind of that balance that you have to weigh when you're kind of deciding which way you want to kind of intervene in terms of a practical sense. So it's an interesting, I'm always just interested to see how people take things like this, which are very much somewhat ambiguous in terms of how they will be interpreted, and kind of see where people run with it. And it's just an interesting thing, particularly in this case where I think people have some pretty strong anecdotes kind of coming into the conversation. So it's a cool one.
Yeah. I think that is all important to discuss, and you see pretty wide credible intervals here, which, again, from a scientist's perspective, that along with the fact that the marginal linear slope at about 2 sessions per week, to me, from a scientist's perspective, I can't sit here and say like frequency independently has a consistently identifiable effect. Now, we'll circle back a little bit to our interpretation and some of our practical application in a little bit. But while we're still discussing the results themselves, let's discuss some of our other results. And let's start with, Zach, go ahead.
One point real quick, just so I want to hit on because again, I'm just thinking about people comparing this to the volume one. One reason that we are potentially viewing these as null findings, despite the absolute number of the slope being higher than volume, is you have to consider the increment at which you're playing with.
Yeah.
So with the volume slope, you're looking at the change in the increase in muscle size per increase in a set. Whereas here,
and that was 0.24%. So one additional set at the average, which I think was about 12 sets per week, our model indicated an additional 0.24% additional hypertrophy. Now, in this case, one additional frequency, one additional session per week at a given volume of frequency leads to our best estimate from the model, 0.32%. So slightly higher, but to your point, I'll let you finish. Those numbers are a little bit different.
Yeah, exactly. That's basically all I was trying to get across. Is that an interesting way to go about it would try to look at the increment of the same relative increase in terms, and that's I guess I hadn't thought about that till right now in terms of trying to like put all those together in the same similar plot to put them on a similar scale. But when you're dealing with an increase of 1, when the range of data is from 1 to 6,
Yep.
1/6 is way higher than 1/45, which was the range for volume. So I just wanted to mention that real quick, but keep going.
Yeah, and I hope no one misinterprets that as necessarily our opinion when presenting these results, but more so just keep that in mind, that what that marginal linear slope is actually kind of telling you.
Yeah, exactly. I don't even, the magnitude of it is obviously important, but I think the magnitudes are easier to see in the primary panel on the left, whereas the consistency and the uncertainty intervals are what I'm mostly concerned with on the right.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I wasn't saying that to like put my view on anything. Really, I was just trying to make it clear that we have a consistent frame of interpretation, despite one number being higher than the other, which it seems counterintuitive at first, but just making that clear.
Cool. With that, we can go to the next figure. So, hey, we found evidence that the fractional frequency method is most likely to describe the underlying data, but hey, maybe you don't like that method, and that's cool too. So we also did meta-regressions in the same exact way, but for different frequency quantification approaches. So this is, and you might not have even noticed the change because they look almost the exact same. This is the effect for total frequency. Are you on the right one now? Cool. So these look almost the exact same. If you look really closely, some of there's more data, slightly more data points at higher frequencies for this plot because, again, in our basic example that I keep returning to, lat pull downs, a day of just lat pull downs for biceps hypertrophy, in the total method would count as a frequency of 1, whereas for fractional would count as half. So therefore, the frequencies are going to be slightly higher. And again, that wasn't really a systematic thing that varied a ton within each study between the two fractional methods. So TLDR, it's very, very similar between fractional and total. You're basically looking at the same thing. It was still a reciprocal model best fit. Basically, everything we just discussed still applies. Now, I do think the next one is quite interesting, and that is the direct frequency quantification method. So again, in our basic example of biceps hypertrophy, bicep curls on one day, lat pull downs on another day, you would just count that as a frequency of 1. And I don't know about you, Zach, but that's kind of how I think of frequency. Not saying that is like the most technically correct or the most likely way to describe the underlying dose-response relationship, because we just found evidence of the opposite of that, but just kind of a shorthand in practice. It can be an interesting way to look at it. And, someone might look at just the fractional result and say, hey, that's not really what we want to know, because obviously if I just do lat pull downs for my biceps on Thursday, that's not going to have really any robust effect, for example, on maybe some of the concepts from that Dankel study and that anabolic limit we mentioned before.
Yeah, I think the way that I've always viewed it, similar to volume, is like I manipulate things and kind of think about it from a coaching perspective on a direct basis. But in the back of your head that the indirect stimulus is there. You're just, when you're making changes, trying to keep that relatively consistent for the most part, I would say, is kind of the way that I think about it. But obviously from this, and then, just another extreme example you could think about is like, if I only did 3 days a week of chin-ups, let's say, you're going to get some bicep growth from that almost certainly, right? So it's like, clearly there's some stimulus being delivered from those types of exercises, which obviously we found evidence for. But I think, again, I personally think about it from an intervention perspective on a direct basis, just kind of in the back of my mind, realizing the indirect stimulus is there, but it's probably not going to be the thing I want to move the needle on the most to be the most efficient, right?
Yeah, very well said. And hey, we wanted to provide a nice analysis of the direct approach, and this was actually a linear best fit. But that linear slope, man, there's really not a whole lot going on there. So you can see the marginal slope, which actually in this case would be the slope throughout the entire relationship because it's linear everywhere. It very much crosses over with zero. So I wouldn't overinterpret this. At the end of the day, the fractional method had the best evidence for describing the underlying dose-response relationship. But this is another confirmatory way of looking at the data and saying, hey, in the way that most people might think of it from a coaching perspective, even when you dose response it that way, man, there's not a whole lot going on here. So I think that's worth keeping in mind. Now, let's actually go back to the fractional one here really quick, Zach. And something that might jump out to the astute listener is that the effects are relatively small just in general. So if you really look at this figure, you might say, hey, at a frequency of 2 times per week, the estimated effect is right around like 2% increase in muscle size. Why might that be the case? So I'm going to discuss that a little bit. And now, Zach, I'm going to ask you to go to the table that is a few figures below where we were. Yeah, right there. So this is the exact same data that underlies the primary meta-regression. This can be found in the supplementary materials, and you basically see the estimated effect at each frequency, okay? And these estimated effects are pretty dang low, right? At a frequency of 1, it's 1.61%. A frequency of 2, it's 2.15%. Frequency of 3, it's 2.42%, etc. And you might say, hey, that's impossible, right? We see muscle growth that is way larger than that. What's really important to interpreting these is just thinking about these in a relative sense as opposed to an absolute sense, okay? And the reason they're so small is because similar to our volume meta-regressions, our frequency meta-regressions were control adjusted, right? So in other words, if the model basically produced a meta-regression that had an effect at 0, more or less everything is shifted down, okay? And in the case of frequency, this is particularly important because there were very few studies, actually, off the top of my head, I don't think any frequency studies had a control effect, so had a true effect at 0. And secondly, because there was such a negligible or inconsistent effect of frequency, the model basically didn't show a strong slope, so therefore assumed a pretty small slope from 0 to 1. And as a result, these values are quite low. So to me, the only reason I point this out is I realize that it might be a little bit confusing at first, but it's due to primarily that control adjustment, and then also to some degree likely due to the volume adjustment that we did that we mentioned before. Any color to add there, Zach?
Yeah, ultimately, just to say that another way, the thing that Josh is kind of stressing here is that if the estimate for a control group, which we assume to be a known 0 and obviously doesn't have a training effect because they didn't train, is, let's say it's 10%, right? So that might be more similar to the overall growth in the, just like if you just take the average growth and all the effects included in the meta-analysis, let's say it's right around 10%, which is pretty high, but let's just say it's 10. And because we didn't have a lot of control data, particularly in frequency direct effects, and the overall dose-response relationship is extremely flat, the estimate for control is going to be way higher than we know it to be in reality. So when you control adjust things, when a control effect is 10%, then all the other effects are going to shift downward substantially because what we're looking at is the relative effects to a control group rather than the absolute prediction. So it's important to look at things that way because, again, if you think about it, if we just assume, and I think it's a good known, again, going back to our other kind of meta-analysis that we did as a pre-step from the Steele data, we know control groups don't have a training effect. That's kind of the whole reason you put them in a study to begin with. So if they're estimating the effect to be 10% growth from a control group, obviously all of our other estimates are upwardly biased. and that is just important from an interpretation perspective. So that it helps to frame the rest of the effects when you kind of adjust for that. So it's a good note, because I think people can look at that and kind of be a little bit counterintuitive, but that's kind of the rationale there.
Cool. Next, we can go to our secondary analyses, which, right there. So these are found in the supplementary materials, and this is a meta-analysis on the left-hand side, and then a forest plot of only studies directly assessing frequency. So again, we alluded to these before, and these are the results. So on the left-hand side here, we see, again, that two-stage meta-regression. And just as a quick review, basically each study, you create a slope for that study, and then you meta-analyze those linear slopes for all frequency studies. And basically what you see here is a linear effect. It happens to be slightly negative. I wouldn't read too much into that really at all. We mentioned this in the previous podcast, but we wouldn't put a ton of stock into these, but other folks might, and they're helpful to kind of be confirmatory. But in our view, this largely confirms the results of the primary meta-regression here, that, hey, the effect just more or less is right around zero on a volume adjusted basis. And then in panel C, right below that meta-regression, you can see the mean linear slope. So again, that slope is slightly negative, but it very much overlaps with zero. Now on the right-hand side here, I think this one is quite helpful, actually personally, for interpreting the results of just the frequency literature in general. So this is a forest plot, which is basically each study's effect of lower versus higher frequency. So on the left-hand side here, you would have a study that benefits or saw slightly greater hypertrophy from a lower frequency. And on the right-hand side, you would see point estimates for studies that provided evidence for higher frequencies being beneficial. And then in panel D at the bottom, that is the pooled effect size. And you can see the width of that diamond there is quite wide. So again, we see a good amount of variability, and the estimate is just slightly positive, so just slightly above zero. But again, similar to the meta-regression in panel A and the linear slope in panel C, it's all basically zero. And just the high-level takeaway from our secondary analyses is in studies comparing lower versus higher frequencies, when you pool them all together, kind of look at them in that sense, there's not a whole lot going on here. There's not a consistently identifiable effect. You pair that with the primary meta-regression, which basically found that, okay, maybe there's a slightly positive slope, but it's not consistently identifiable. We see wide credible intervals. All right, in general, it's as a scientist, you can't necessarily say, hey, we see this very consistent and strong effect of frequency on a volume adjusted basis. Zach?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's helpful to see these, and I think this kind of goes to confirm the point about the kind of two different frames of reference that I was kind of like trying to set up, is that yes, you could very much view things in terms of, oh, this leans positive, and there may be even a high probability that's greater than zero. But in these kind of contexts, particularly in like the meta-analytic case, where we don't have, again, in an absolute sense, a ton of statistical power necessarily, but in a relative sense, it's all we're ever going to get. Mm-hmm. And we don't see a consistently identifiable effect in that circumstance. I think we're probably better off in a scientific application of saying, hey, there's not much going on here. And when we view things in that kind of direct comparisons only, that kind of echoes that message a little bit better. So,
how do you interpret the fact that the primary meta-regression, let's just be like super charitable, or maybe not charitable, liberal with our interpretation, say, oh, it was slightly positive, that mean linear slope was for the most part above zero, and I training is my life. Okay, as a result, I'm going to train with higher frequencies. How do you compare that liberal interpretation with basically, even if you were to be super liberal with the secondary analysis, there's basically nothing going on? How do you interpret those two perspectives? So slightly positive in the primary meta-regression for frequency, but then almost certainly nothing in the secondary analyses.
So I think it's the first and foremost, like it goes to underline the differences in these approaches. So the first thing is to say there's just fundamentally way more data in the primary analyses, and then in the second approaches here, In the forest plot, we're not considering the differences in frequency. So a study that's 1 versus 6 is going to be treated the exact same as 2.1 versus 2.2. So that fundamental difference isn't being accounted for. And then finally, in the two-stage analysis, essentially there's no borrowing of information across studies in addition to having less data in general, which is going to make each one of the slopes that is contributing to those meta-analytic estimates of the slope and the intercept that kind of come together for the two-stage meta-regression. It's probably going to be pulled in kind of wild different directions for each one of those individual effects that has none of the shrinkage and all the stuff that we talked about in the other episode. So put simply, I think they're all looking at things in 3 fundamentally different ways. So from that perspective, I think it makes sense. They all kind of tell us a different thing. And so even from that perspective, I would lean the heaviest on the main model. And again, that's why it's the main model in the first place. But I would say that you can get, just looking at the leaning of direction in those kind of things, again, I think is challenging because of the fact that this is basically the case where we would theoretically be able to identify something that was there. Now, the perfect meta-analysis in our field, again, would probably combine every single one of the training interventions, adjust for all the heterogeneity across studies that's going to actually systematically affect things. Maybe we find a effective frequency in that case. Maybe that's there. But the way that I would view this in this circumstance, now finally actually answering your question now that I'm dodging, is in these instances where the upside is low, I think the primary thing you have to ask yourself is, what is the cost? So, these kind of decisions from a practical perspective is always cost-benefit analysis. But when the benefit is low, you have to be really, really sure the costs aren't high. And so I think you can conceivably have, particularly from a practical line of things, where too high of a frequency could have some negative consequences. And I think you've talked about this particularly from your practical experience in terms of, hey, I can't prove it. The data is not going to say it, but it seems like if you're actually training hard in each one of the sessions that you're kind of including in a week, that injury risk or something to that effect may be associated with that. So like the point is, you could come up with a few relatively, noticeable costs associated with things. So I think you have to be really clear about what your beliefs are on those costs to weigh that against the benefit. And because the benefit is so small, I just think that makes you have a little bit of pause. So with all that wrapped up, sure, you can view it as a slightly neutral to positive effect, but I'm definitely not doing that with like a very enthusiastic recommendation, if that makes sense. And more so, I would definitely view that as more of a logistical thing to set up in the context of literally everything else. And it's going to be one of the last stones I lay in terms of somebody's program. Insofar as I'm thinking about the direct effect of that variable for hypertrophy.
So in the volume podcast, we spent a lot of time, or at least a decent bit of time, discussing how we suspect the diminishing returns might be a little bit stronger than what our model suggested. There were a few reasons for that. One of the reasons is that there wasn't a ton of control effects. So a ton of values at 0 sets, which might have kind of indicated to the model that, hey, the first set in a week is really important or really beneficial. And then that could have informed the rest of the model that the diminishing returns are slightly stronger. I don't think that would completely fundamentally shift the nature of the dose-response relationship to all of a sudden you see a plateau at 4 sets a week. It's not what I'm saying. But I again, our kind of conclusion as of recording that podcast was, if anything, we suspect that the model is overstating the dose-response relationship and the diminishing returns are slightly stronger in actuality. In this case of frequency, do you have any speculations on that front and any particularly around the control effects? Because, again, in the primary model, we do have some control effects, but those are all from volume studies. So to me, that's a feature that we have that additional data to anchor the dose-response relationship.
Yeah, because if we didn't, then it'd be literally flat.
Exactly. So to me, our model leaves the door open for a potential inherent volume-independent effect for frequency. Granted, I would have a hard time seeing it become this overwhelmingly vital variable. Maybe that's the case. I would just have a hard based on our analyses here. I have a hard time seeing that change occur. But the fact that we had a data set that was both volume and frequency studies was important for potentially identifying that and leaving that door open, as opposed to maybe an effect that was even more convincingly null.
So it's a honestly a great point. I hadn't considered that till you just said that. As soon as you're like, you brought up the context of the control groups for understating the diminishing returns in the volume case. I think it's the exact opposite in the case of frequency, because if our estimate of control conditions is essentially 10%,
it wasn't 10%.
Whatever it was. Yeah. Just using that as the example we were talking about earlier, but it's considerably higher than it theoretically should be.
Right.
Then ultimately what we're saying is we're kind of quote unquote missing control data.
Yeah.
And if anything, I would suspect it's going to look very similar to the strength one, in the sense that I don't think it's this linear effect up to 6 times a week.
Yeah.
But
not.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I cut you off. You want to finish?
Yeah, I was just saying, like, if there is kind of a quote unquote meaningful part of that curve, I think it's probably early in the frequency relationship, going from 0 to 1 to maybe 2 to 3.
Yeah.
I don't think we're going to see a meaningful slope from 4 to 6 necessarily. At least that's just my opinion. I don't know. That could change. But I do think that the early part of that curve may be a little bit
understated.
Understated
in terms of the
control
slopes.
effects are overstated. Yeah, the language is hard there. But yeah, I think if anything, I think it could look a little bit more similar to the strength curve, which obviously we'll touch on in a different episode. But
to be clear, it probably wouldn't look the exact same.
Yeah.
But you're saying, to kind of give a little bit of a spoiler for an upcoming episode on the effects of frequency on strength, there was a pretty decent relationship there, which we'll dive
early
into.
Frequencies in particular.
What's that?
At early frequencies in particular.
Yeah. So what Zach is saying is not that, if you improve the control estimate, that all of a sudden you're going to get this really strong, reliable relationship all the way up to 3 or 4 sessions per week. Again, we'll dive into the interpretation of that dose response later on. But what I think we're both saying is that, again, just like with the volume podcast, man, like, this is our, I hope it comes across, our best faith attempt at looking at this from multiple different angles. Once we get into the interpretation and our perspective, which again is just that, our perspective, we're going to acknowledge a lot of different perspectives that we are aware of along the way, and kind of integrate those into the various uncertainty we see. But ultimately, it's just important to emphasize these limitations, right? And this is the limitation of what we think is the best way to look at the question. So if I could snap my fingers overnight and have 50 frequency studies that have control groups, maybe that slope from 0 to 1 is considerably stronger, which it almost certainly would be. And therefore, the dose-response modeling would be a little bit stronger from 1 to 2. To your point, I don't think from 2 beyond, especially from 3 beyond, all that much would change. And I don't think if we were to see a slope that mean linear slope would go from 0.3 to 5%, but maybe it goes from 0.3 to, I hesitate to do this, but maybe it doubles. That would be reasonable, and it would be a little bit more notable, maybe be a little bit more important in program design, but it would still have to kind of be compared to some of these other variables, specifically volume, where we kind of talked about 1 unit of volume, so 1 set, being kind of in the same ballpark of frequency, at least from our models here.
And most importantly, I think the thing I always struggle with frequency is, like, I think the baseline level that you sit at with frequency, because there's just naturally less options, is more likely to converge with kind of theoretical optimal than volume is necessarily. Because if we're saying you can train with 0 to 45 sets per week, again, I'm not saying to do 45 sets. Go watch the other podcast. I just know that as the upper end of our data set. You could fall anywhere within that kind of in your own devices. But for frequency, you're probably, if you're just somebody who lifts weights maybe a little bit more seriously than your average person, you're probably hitting every muscle group 1 to 3 times a week. Just as a baseline level. And obviously, if this was an important variable, you may want to scoot that up in one direction or another. But I think you're in the Goldilocks zone almost by default for frequency, where I don't necessarily think that is automatically the case for volume, if that makes sense.
Yeah. That's a good point. We're starting to get into our interpretation. So full disclosure, now we're layering in our own personal experience or personal interpretation here, is that it's harder to mess this one up, if that makes sense. Now that I say that out loud, in a lot of ways, our volume recommendation was like, hey, it's kind of hard to mess that up too, because low volumes can result in great progress, and high volumes might have indirect negative consequences. So a lot of people might kind of fall in a reasonable volume range pretty easily anyway.
Training's hard to mess up. If you just train hard a couple times a week, you're probably chilling for the most part.
Yeah, we're going to get to that in a little bit, because I think there's, I know you're joking, but I think there's a kernel of truth there. I do want to finish our results here, because I'm excited about the interpretation, but I want to make sure we do our results justice. Specifically, we have a figure. This is in the supplementary materials. These are what are called pairwise comparisons for frequency. So these can be found in the supplementary materials. And as much as I kind of said I don't like the internet earlier in the podcast, this was a great example of just the internet being a cool place, and I was mostly joking before, because just from like a discussion from a peer in the field, we were kind of, I guess, just to put it simply, hey, what's your confidence that X sets is greater than Y sets? Like, how do you quantify that in that model? There's a lot of ways to answer that question. Again, refer to 5-hour podcast if you're really interested. But another way to look at that is by basically taking the model estimates. So to be clear, this table is effectively derived from the primary meta-regression for the effects of fractional frequency on hypertrophy. So that main model we've spent a good amount of time talking about. And what this is it's comparing two different frequencies and saying, hey, what is the difference likely to be here, right? And what is the probability that it's going to be greater than what's called the smallest detectable effect size. We haven't spent any time talking about the smallest detectable effect size in this podcast. Again, refer to the volume one if you want to check that out, because that's important for conceptualizing our results here. But the TLDR of the smallest detectable effect size is that it is about, at least with our methods, it was about 2% for hypertrophy. And put simply, there's a lot of variation, as we've mentioned multiple times, in training studies. So if you see a meta-analytic estimate that is not different by at least 2%, it's highly unlikely for it to be not due to error. Or in other words, your confidence should be diminished. Now, you can't, there's a lot that goes into comparing two different point estimates. And Zach, I don't know if you have something to add real quick.
I was just going to say, for the smallest detectable effect size, it's not necessarily that if it's less than that, it's definitely due to error. It's this that even if it was less than that, we wouldn't really be able to detect it consistently.
Yeah.
So just making that clear. But go ahead.
Yeah, that's well said and important to add, because I probably didn't say that super clearly. But ultimately, put simply, that right-hand column that is indicated by P.SDES, that stands for probability that the difference is greater than the smallest detectable effect size. That is, in my view, as a scientist, what I can say, hey, I feel really confident that our estimates at a frequency of X versus Y is different. And, I'm sure the one or two super interested viewers / listeners will look at this a little bit closer, but suffice it to say that any comparison from a frequency of 1 versus a frequency higher than that, the highest probability that the difference is greater than the smallest detectable effect size is 15%. Okay? So in other words, again, this is just another kind of angle to look at the data, and we think it's a valuable one, again, as a result of discussions online. And in the case of frequency, this provides additional insight that, man, these differences, once you get to a frequency of 1, any frequency above that, it's just hard to say as a scientist, yes, we see a consistently identifiable effect that is unlikely to be due to error. Now, again, practitioner hat on, maybe that's a little bit different. Add in the, especially the control adjustment discussion we were just mentioning. all the other different factors that frequency might depend on, you might come to a different conclusion. And we are fully on board with other perspectives, as we've mentioned multiple times. But I think this is a really cool way to look at it. We did add them for volume as well. We didn't discuss that in the last podcast because we added them after the fact, but ultimately I thought that was important to highlight. Zach, unless you have anything to add, well, I guess I'll just ask, do you have anything to add? Okay. We have a few other results here that I think are cool to look at before we finally move into our interpretation. So these are not in the manuscript. These are not in the supplementary materials, but ultimately we do find them to be interesting. And again, these are not the most formal approaches. We don't have our methods laid out anywhere, but these are us kind of exploring some things.
Let's call it what it is. This is spitballing.
Yeah, this is spitballing with some common things that might come to mind for the average listener is ultimately what it comes down to. And as we were preparing for the podcast, we're like, yeah, we've looked at that almost certainly at some point, just because we're curious as well. Let's include that for the viewer and kind of add some color here. So the first one is a very flexible approach to dose response modeling. So what you see here is instead of having a certain dose response model, this allows for a lot more flexibility at different frequencies. So for example, let's say there's kind of a Goldilocks zone of frequency across the literature. This would probably allow you to identify that a little bit better. In the red line here, those are just frequency studies. And then I believe there are two different blue lines, and those are whether they are volume studies or volume and frequency studies, I believe.
Yep. The light blue is just volume studies, and the dark blue is all of it together. I'm getting this on the front end, so we just discuss it. I want to triple underline spitballing, as we discussed for like an hour, I think, about the importance of accounting for nesting, all that kind of stuff. This is obviously those things are important, and it doesn't make these things completely useless. It's just
a quick peek.
Yeah, exactly. It's a quick peek. Is there anything here that's like incontrovertible evidence to say, oh, we should probably take a look at that a little bit closer?
Yeah.
And that, again, doesn't mean it's systematic and doesn't mean it's removed of all influences that make it a little bit limited. But I just want to make sure that's clear on the front end.
Yeah, so to me, I wanted to see this just to kind of as a conceptual check, even though our main model found this reciprocal best fit. I'm like, man, maybe that's just what the computer is telling us, but instead there's kind of this clear Goldilocks zone at, say, 2 times per week or 3 times per week. Again, high level, I don't think that's necessarily the case here. We see a good amount of variability. The next one that I will point out here are all of the individual study level slopes. Go ahead and go to the next figure and then go back. And then go back. All right, that's fine. There's a little bit of, that's fine. So this is a helpful way to basically look at the primary meta-regression or see what informs the primary meta-regression. So these blue lines here are individual outcomes of different frequencies, again, on a volume-adjusted basis. And you can see some are positive, some are negative. A lot of them are pretty dang flat. But I think this is helpful to see that this is ultimately what goes into the dose-response relationship. Now, there's a ton of nesting that goes into it. There is various different ways that each effect is accounted for in that main model. Again, see our volume podcast. But I think this is helpful to see just that underlying variability, and also helps emphasize that point we made early on in the podcast that, yes, studies can absolutely differ in their findings. The next one I want to move to is... Actually, it's not the next figure, but the one after that. Beautiful. Another common thing, and we mentioned this early on in the podcast, is that for trained individuals, that there's reason to believe that the anabolic period post-training is shorter. So in other words, the beneficial effects of frequency are more likely to be evident for trained individuals compared to untrained individuals. So again, quick check here at trained versus untrained individuals. Those estimates are obviously you see a slightly higher absolute effect for untrained folks, but the relationship is pretty dang similar here, and it's not like we see a super strong slope for trained individuals and no effect at all for untrained individuals. The next thing, and we're going to discuss this quite a bit more, is kind of this interaction between volume and frequency. So we're probably going to circle back to this a little bit more here in our interpretation, but again, I just kind of want to present these quick peek relationships here on the front end before we dive into that interpretation. Trying to think of the best way to frame this. Ultimately, frequency doesn't operate independently, is what it comes down to. And one possibility is that the effects of frequency might only show up with certain per session volumes. That's basically what it comes down to. Some perspectives are that higher frequencies are only going to be beneficial if per session volumes are low enough so that you can recover for the next session and benefit from that next session. That's a really interesting idea. Honestly, I think that's a really interesting idea. Another one that I think is honestly a little bit more common, again, not saying it's better or worse, is that the beneficial effects of higher frequency are only going to show up with higher total volumes because by the end of a high volume session, performance is going to be so bad, fatigue will be so high, you're not benefiting quite as much. So therefore, if you're doing a very high volume program, therefore you're going to strongly benefit from higher frequencies. And we tried to look at this as kind of what it comes down to, or take a quick peek. And we kind of roughly classified each study, or I should say each effect, as not recoverable or recoverable. Zach, do you have offhand the rough criteria that you used for that? So effectively what we did is we said, hey, it's not necessarily a per session volume that's going to determine how recovered you are for the next one, because it also depends on when that next session is, right? I could do 100 sets today. I'm going to be smoked, but I'll be ready to train in 2025. So that also applies on a smaller time scale, right? Presumably, if you are doing more sets in a session, you're going to require longer to recover. And if you're doing less sets in a session, you're going to require less time to recover. So in this case, we tried to account for that. And I'll kick it over to you, Zach, for the general criteria you used.
Yeah, so ultimately, we tried to kind of, again, we for this entire project, we've tried to keep a pulse on kind of the different perspectives that people have on this issue, and this concept of kind of trying to reveal the potential effects of frequency that I think makes sense has been something we've tried to kind of understand. And I think the approach that we landed on, that is by far not without some limitations. Just as a basic example, proximity to failure obviously influences recovery. We didn't necessarily account for that in this, but essentially to be considered recoverable, if you were training with a frequency of 1 time per week, anything up to 12 sets per session was permitted as recoverable. If you were training 2 times a week, then you would have had a per session volume that was 5 sets or less. And then for 3 times a week training or above, you basically would need to have a per session volume that was 3 sets or less. So essentially, the greater frequency you're training at, the lower per session volume you would need for it to be considered recoverable, because that next session is coming faster, right? So that's kind of defining the broad bounds, again, which are limited. Proximity to failure isn't accounted for, repetition range isn't accounted for, rest intervals aren't accounted for, all things that presumably influence the session-to-session recovery a decent amount. But nonetheless, I think it's a relatively good faith explanation or examination of this kind of idea that we've seen from a few folks.
Yeah, well said. Ultimately, I just want to really emphasize that the study slopes, that one is pretty clear cut. It's that one I feel good about. Someone looking at that pretty seriously, because that basically underlies the dose response relationship. But the specifically the training status one and this recoverable versus non-recoverable plot, these are very, very limited, because the criteria that Zach mentioned, or just that conceptual approach, there's arguably just not enough studies. And some of those studies, if perhaps recovery is a really important variable or factor to benefit from higher frequencies, like you mentioned, other things might have to be in place for it to truly be recoverable. Maybe training all the way to failure is not conducive for recovery. Maybe higher rep ranges are not totally conducive. Maybe training status is not necessarily where it needs to be for things to resolve themselves, or for the effects of frequency to show up. And just beyond that, we spent a lot of time in the previous podcast discussing the limitations of moderator analyses in general. Would you say these apply about the same? Those limitations apply about the same? They apply even more so or less so here?
Specifically for frequency, or specifically in this case?
I would say for this one.
For this one in particular, I would say, so I'm just trying to think off the top of my head what would be required to actually look at this. So
it just depends on the moderator analysis, to be honest.
Yeah, ultimately what you would need to have confidence in is that you would need to have at least some direct examination of the issue. So in this case, you would need to have within the same study, which basically the reason that's important is because that's equating all these other factors that would potentially have variance in the effect sizes, like the intervention duration, the training status participants. All these things are relatively equated within the same study, but then you would need to have within a given outcome, you would need to have a group that is recoverable and not recoverable.
Yeah.
So you would need to have a frequency study that has an outcome that is examining things in a recoverable basis, and an outcome that's non-recoverable. So is a way you could think about it is like, let's say lower body training within that study, and they measured both lower body and upper body hypertrophy. The lower body volumes, because people know that squats are challenging, they were relatively lower. So the per session volumes were in the kind of quote unquote recoverable range for the frequency comparison that you're looking at. But for the upper body, because people generally train those more aggressively, they're not recoverable. And therein lies the problem, because what I just described is a direct examination of that interaction, but it also contains an interaction with upper and lower body. So it's just so you get into a land of things that are just really, really challenging. So for these types of granular questions, to have the statistical power to need to examine that effectively on the individual study level for basically every time you go up an interaction term. So we want to care about the effective volume. Let's say we need X amount of participants. I want to look at the effective volume interacting with training status. You're basically going up in an exponential relationship in terms of the number of participants that you need to effectively identify that. And that's within the context of an individual study in which all the other things are accounted for. So on the level of meta-analysis, obviously we have more power because we're accumulating multiple studies, but that's really only able to be fully taken advantage of when we have a decent number of effects that are directly examining that interaction, or we have so much data that we can adjust for all the confounding variables that you might see in like an observational setting that we kind of touched on in the volume analysis. So long story short, because there's even less frequency studies to begin with, and because this is probably never directly investigated, I'd say it's like very, very limited.
Yeah, very limited. For example, in the volume podcast, we discussed the moderator analysis of rest periods. If you do an estimate at a rest period of 1 minute compared to an estimate at 3 minutes, the slope is non-significantly, but I'd say notably stronger for the estimate at 1 minute. But if you do two things, that completely goes away. The first is categorize the rest periods. So if you do less than 90 seconds versus greater than 90 seconds, the slopes are basically the exact same. And perhaps more importantly, if you don't assume a linear effect of rest periods and you assume a linear log effect of rest periods, which better aligns with the rest period research in the first place, again, the difference in the slopes goes away. The same thing could apply here in the sense that recoverability almost certainly isn't a binary thing, right? But here it was treated binarily. There's probably like, I don't even know what that relationship would.
You should quantify recoverability on basically a 0 to 100% scale. Is what you should essentially do.
Right, and our goal with looking at it in this way, looking at training status, looking at the maximum flexibility plot, whatever the case may be. The goal is just to say, like, hey, these are interesting things. Right now, there's just not a whole lot going on there that jumps off the page for us to be like, hey, guys, really, really consider this. And this is just a massive, and hey, guys, this is a really massive limitation. We need future studies right now. But instead, hey, this, maybe there's something here, maybe, or at least we're acknowledging that this could modify it. Doesn't seem to be the case from what we see, but there's just so many limitations to answering such granular questions, and in a way, kind of acknowledging that by, this plot, you can see how big those credible intervals are, right? So our goal is to acknowledge a lot of different perspectives and possibilities, and provide some data from what we have, which is ultimately quite limited. All right, with that, let's move into our interpretation here for the last 30 minutes or so. And Zach, I know you just took our visual off the screen, but you can go ahead and go back, because this is the way that I ultimately conceptualize frequency. And I'm not saying you have to conceptualize frequency this way, but you can think of it as kind of a two-factor question. So when I take a step back and I think about frequency, from our model, okay, we didn't see this consistently identifiable positive effect. But obviously, frequency does matter from a very, very high level, right? I can't train once a month and pack all my volume into one session. Like, something has to give here. So the question in practice, or for our purposes here, is within reasonable time frames, and I would define a reasonable time frame as training a muscle anywhere from 1 to 7 times per week. Within that time frame, does how you allocate your volume matter, right? Does your frequency matter on a volume equated basis? And to answer that question, kind of the fundamental frequency questions are twofold. So Zach, you can go ahead and go to the next figure here for our visual experience for the listeners. The first is whether there is a quote unquote cap to per session volumes. Okay. So when I say cap, I don't necessarily mean that there's like a hard cap, but is there a practical cap? Is there a physiological cap, at which point there are just really strong diminishing returns that it clearly is no longer worth it? Another way to think about this is, instead of talking about the cap of the dose-response relationship, maybe the effects are still positive, but they're so much weaker compared to the first set of the session. So another way to think about the potential benefits is that first sets are so much stronger than later sets, and within the weekly timeline, you are going to want to get as many quote-unquote first sets as possible. Then the question becomes, does the frequency impact the effectiveness of first sets? So if we think about our volume, our weekly volume meta-regression, we did see that initial sets were the most efficient, right? But does that change based on the frequency? So in other words, if I have one first set per week on Monday, do I also kind of get a first set effect on Thursday, right? Or is it more of a weekly first set thing, right? So that is kind of an underlying question. Now, on the other side of things, so we just talked about the stimulus there. On the other side of things is what happens in the post-anabolic period, if you will. So presumably at some point after a training session, again, if we think of an extreme of training once a month, obviously at some point you're no longer going to be benefiting from that training session, and you're presumably going to experience some atrophy if you don't continue to train at some point. So the question becomes, again, within our practical constraints here, does that have an effect that ultimately leads to higher frequencies having a benefit? And to me, this is the two-factor question when thinking about frequency. For question number one, see Remert et al., which will be available soon, and we're going to have a podcast about that one as well. For number two, I think this one is quite interesting, and there is some evidence to suggest that atrophy can occur quite quickly. So if you go to the next figure, Zach, we actually co-teach a class at our university about training in microgravity. because we often take for granted the beneficial effects of just resisting gravity on a day-to-day basis. So one way to simulate the effects of microgravity is to use bed rest, or there are some other models as well. But in this case, from bed rest, you see really dramatic decreases in both muscle size and muscle strength right away. So once you're no longer resisting gravity, this paper from, I believe it's pronounced Marusik in 2021, basically provides some data indicating that, hey, muscle loss occurs really quickly once you stop using it, right? So once you stop, producing force, atrophy occurs really quickly. Now, obviously, you're not in bed rest if you're doing a bro split for the rest of the week, but maybe this applies to some degree. And once you're no longer in that post-training anabolic period, maybe before you train the muscle again, there's going to be some slight atrophy, and that's going to add up to a worse hypertrophic effect of lower frequencies. Now, obviously, we started with our results here, and I think from our results, it doesn't seem that would strongly be the case, but it is, again, a possibility that might play out in certain populations or certain scenarios. For the first question, if you go back to the previous figure, Zach, if we think back about that first question, I would say that one is a little bit more open-ended because A, we still need to discuss Jake's manuscript, and B, the per-session volumes in the included studies wasn't all that high, right? So we have some insight into high per-session volumes, but we don't have insights into some extreme scenarios, like, say, 20-plus sets per sessions. And in that case, maybe there is a point at which there is an inverted U or a strong plateau. Again, more to come there with Jake's manuscript. But that is how I conceptualize frequency. And ultimately, our data provides some insight into these two questions by indicating that, again, there is not this clear, consistent, identifiable effect of frequency. So to me, let's grant the assumption, just for discussion purposes, that there is a positive effect of frequency, but we just didn't find it for whatever reason. And I can think of three pretty strong reasons why that's the case. The first that I'll discuss is that frequency is highly, highly individual, right? So maybe it's the case that I recover much slower than Zach, and therefore I should only be training once a week, and you should be training 3 or 4 times a week per muscle. And you could think of that within an individual on a muscle-to-muscle basis as well. And then when you pull it all together in a study, let alone a meta-analysis, you don't really see an effect. What I would say is that definitely could be the case, but you happen to have done your PhD on whether that is something that is reasonable to identify on an individual level. So I'll let you briefly chime in there.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is an entire podcast within itself to talk about this stuff in depth, but I think trying to make individual level claims or just draw individual level inferences from pretty much any study in our field is strongly limited. There are just, as we've talked about, sources of variability here multiple times. Pretty much anything that you want to draw between individuals in terms of like high responder, low responder, in terms of high fatigability, low fatigability, in terms of high recoverability, low recoverability in this case. Any determination like that, and consequently how that may or may not influence the effectiveness of any intervention or between interventions, requires some really, really specific study designs that I just, it's hard to even communicate to people how much this variability blinds our ability to answer these questions. Like, you know, and to be very clear, I've made these claims a lot before I started my PhD. Like, the Damas study is one that I
Damas 2019, baby.
always come back to, that I've used so many times as evidence that a targeted training intervention is better for some individuals than other individuals. And ultimately, the fundamental flaw there is that you don't have the counterfactual example where either Josh or I repeat the exact same intervention multiple times in a row. And having done this multiple times with multiple data sets and looked into it a lot, I can tell you, when you do that, the variability that exhibits is so much higher than the differences or the variability that you see within an individual between interventions or between individuals to the same intervention.
Yeah.
And the point there is, while those types of hypotheses can absolutely be very, very intriguing, and I'm not going to discount the fact that they even probably exist in a quote unquote true sense. Like there's almost it's almost self-evident that there's some genetic variability in recoverability or the training intervention that you would respond best to, etc. But the magnitude of these differences and our ability to detect it in the face of all these other sources of variability, I have quite little confidence in. I'll put it that way. And ultimately, I think just spending too much time there, I think, is probably not the lowest hanging fruit or the highest leverage kind of place to make your decision making based upon.
Yeah, and one of the data sets that you alluded to is a data set that our lab collected over the course of like 2 years, and we'll see the light of day at some point. So that'll be coming at some point, because that was your main dissertation project, which was, I think, going to be pretty game changing for a lot of different reasons. But ultimately, the point we're circling around here is that, hey, if we go back to our two questions of a potential cap at which there's kind of that per session cap that Dankel alluded to, that we discussed early on in the podcast. Let me look back at what their example, they called them quote unquote wasted sets, or an anabolic limit from a given session. And then also the fact that perhaps there's atrophy in the post-anabolic period that might kind of add up to lower frequencies being a little bit worse. Again, those very well might be the case, and we're kind of trying to paint the picture for why those things might not have really shown up all that much in our data set, because our results were pretty negligible. One possibility is that frequency is just so highly individual that, when you pull it all together, you get null findings. That very well might be the case. It's just almost impossible to make that claim from a scientific perspective, because you can't just look at individual data points. And you literally studied that for 4 years.
Yeah,
so
it's unfalsifiable to some degree. Like, it's just so hard to detect that it's not saying that it's not the case. It's just like I said, from a leverage position in terms of like what is the thing we're going to hinge our decision making off of.
Yeah,
you could pretty much say that about anything.
Measurement error is a thing, my friends. Measurement error is very much a thing. That's one possibility for why our data set didn't find an effective frequency, if there really is one. Another possibility, or the two final possibilities, are related to the context of the included studies, specifically the per session volumes. So let's start with whether per session volumes were too high. So we alluded to this a little bit before, but one possibility is that the per session volumes used in the included studies were too high, and therefore the participants could not recover in time for their next session, especially in a high frequency program or in a high frequency condition, and therefore they didn't really benefit from the high frequencies. Okay. Again, we did a quick look at that analysis previously of quote unquote recoverable versus non-recoverable volumes. We're not saying that is the nail in the coffin against this by any means, but it is a quick look at some of the data we do have if you were to slice it and dice it a little bit, with the caveat that slicing and dicing it is very risky and not conclusive. But nonetheless, the per session volumes weren't all that high in the included studies, and I think that's important to keep in mind. Most of the per session volumes were less than 10. Now, there are obviously exceptions to that, but this plot provides some indications there. So again, we want to leave the door open to that possibility. It's a really interesting idea, but I do think it's important to keep in mind, again, the per session volumes weren't all that high in the included studies, and at the end of the day, the growth across all of the included hypertrophy studies was pretty dang good. So even if there could have been slightly better growth if the individuals were recovered, it didn't preclude them from growing. And that's definitely something that's quite interesting for future investigation. So, Zach, anything to add on that possibility that per session volumes were too high?
No, I have a theoretical to pose at you when the time is right. You just tell me no when that is correct.
Okay.
For the time.
Would it make sense to go into the possibility that per session volumes were too low next?
Yeah, go for that first.
Cool. So on the other side of the coin, if you will, is that maybe we would see a beneficial effect of frequency if per session volumes were higher than they actually were. So in other words, you might have heard that before, that, hey, the beneficial effects of frequency are only going to show up at higher volumes. Again, if you go back to that plot of recoverable versus non-recoverable volumes, we didn't necessarily see that, right? Because non-recoverable volumes, quote unquote, again, I'm using that loosely, are going to be just higher volume, higher per session volume protocols. And again, that didn't see a stronger benefit to frequency. Again, terms and conditions apply, very, very limited. And we just don't have strong evidence for that. But these are all possibilities that we want to tip our cap to, and perhaps, play a small role in future investigation. So to summarize, we didn't find a strong, consistently identifiable effective frequency. Maybe that slope was slightly positive, especially when you kind of go from 1 to 2 sessions per week. However, frequency is a tricky thing to study because there's just so much variability in potential recoverability between training statuses, different muscle groups trained, different exercises used, different rep ranges, different proximities to failure. So although from a high level, frequency did not seem to lead to a consistently identifiable positive effect, there are 3 main possibilities if there were to truly be an effect that we're not accounting for. That is that frequency is highly individual. The per session volumes of the included studies were just too high, and therefore participants couldn't recover and therefore benefit from higher frequencies. Or quite the opposite, that per session volumes were too low and higher frequencies would be better if the included studies just used higher volumes. We're not necessarily saying one or multiple of those are right or wrong, but instead just kind of trying to tip our cap to all of those possible perspectives and say, hey, it might be the case, and maybe we'll learn more. Hopefully we'll learn more in the future.
Money. Okay, I guess I'll pose to you something I was thinking about the other day and see if you can poke any holes in it. So recently, well, first and foremost, the kind of the narrative around frequency, when I was kind of prepping my notes for the show, I started thinking about it, and it really mirrors distribution of protein for meals to me a lot. And essentially, the short narrative on protein distribution is it doesn't seem to matter a whole lot. Quite similar to frequency, right? On the edge cases, maybe having a little bit higher of a protein frequency beyond like a couple times per day. You have the odd intermittent fasting study and stuff to show maybe it's not a huge deal, but I think my understanding is it's like directionally definitely not a consistent thing by any means, but maybe lean in the slightly higher frequency side of things in terms of protein intake. That was until very recently. There was a pretty big study that I'm not going to pretend to understand the detailed methods of. I do not read protein research very often, by Jorn Trauman that kind of discussed this upper end of the protein kind of I don't even know the correct term. This is exposing how little I read this research, but I thought it was a useful analogy. But ultimately, the previous narrative was describing what's sometimes called the muscle full effect, where you're essentially eating a sufficient amount of protein to trigger the muscle protein synthetic response from a meal, and that's going to upregulate muscle protein synthesis, to which additional protein, specifically additional leucine, doesn't really seem to have a meaningfully greater effect. And you would be better off, very similar to training session, splitting up that protein into multiple feeding windows to have the greatest area under the curve in terms of MPS. Now, what this Trauman study did that was interesting, and again, I'm not restating the results here. I have not read it that closely. I just kind of thinking it's a useful analogy. Is, to my understanding, it's substantially raised the kind of the range at which we can benefit from additional protein in a meal. Mm-hmm. And predominantly what happens is just that the time that you have area under the curve is just extended. And ultimately you end up metabolizing that protein. It contributes to muscle protein synthesis, and you end up oxidizing it in the way that you would broken up over multiple meals. It just takes longer. Mm-hmm. And I thought about that, and like ultimately to me, that's kind of what it sounds like is happening with frequency. Terms and conditions apply, whole 3-hour podcast, etc. But ultimately, you know, assuming adherence to the training protocol, higher per session volumes just maybe elevating things for longer. And if you combine higher volumes and higher frequencies, which is just increasing the amount higher per session volumes with higher frequencies, which is ultimately just increasing the amount of volume you're doing per week, you kind of get back to our previous discussion in the last episode, where higher volumes on average with diminishing returns, etc., are leading to more growth over the course of a week. Poke holes in that. What do you think about that? Is that a useful analogy?
Yeah, I think kind of just to...
Here's the graph as Josh talks, because I didn't put it up while I was speaking.
Yeah, so I think kind of what you're getting at is it resembles protein intake and to some degree just calorie intake in the sense that the overall dosage is what seems to be driving the effect, at least from our results here, as opposed to when exactly that occurs. And that's not to say there aren't some acorns, if you will, in the protein distribution research that would indicate that there is a slight effect. Same with the frequency research, right?
And same with the fact that there's diminishing returns across the week, right? Like theoretically, that could be a manifestation of these things underlying it.
Right. But ultimately, from a practical perspective, we want to know within practical constraints, in this case, training a muscle 1 to 7 times per week. In the case of protein research, anywhere from consuming a bolus of protein 1 to, say, 7 times a day or 1 to 6 times a day. Does it matter within? Because obviously protein distribution matters in the grand sense. You can't eat all of your protein for the year on January 1st. You also can't do all of your training for the year on January 1st. But within practical constraints, both of these seem to maybe lean slightly in the direction of greater frequencies being more beneficial, but not overwhelmingly so, and not the primary variable that's predicting the results, at least when we model it with the methods used here. But again, you have to keep in mind the context of the underlying studies. But I think at this point, I'm relatively comfortable just putting my cards on the table a little bit with like my perspective on things. This is largely from a practical perspective. These might be a little bit opposing at first, but I'll note 2 anecdotes. The first is that for me personally, I have a very hard time training with high frequencies. I just my hamstrings still get sore for an entire week whenever I train them, really no matter what I do, and I'm okay with that. And when I try to do higher frequencies, it just doesn't go all that well. On the other hand, I'll also mention that high frequency bench press training in powerlifting is quite common, and folks seem to really benefit from it. And we have multiple clients at Data Driven Strength that have bench pressed more than 400 pounds as a result of bench pressing 4 to 5 times per week with programs that don't really look like you can recover from each of those sessions, right? They are tough sessions. Now, everything's manipulated very strategically, especially for an elite powerlifter, in terms of when those sessions are occurring, how difficult they are. There's some other considerations. Also, strength is a different beast than hypertrophy, but they're almost certainly not atrophying as they are increasing their bench press. So I guess what I'm saying here is that frequency does seem to matter, at least in my experience, in my coaching practice, quite a bit. But it largely comes down to practical considerations and appears to be something that you just use strategically with the skill of training or the skill of coaching in this case to allow those primary variables to kind of settle into place. I'll put the powerlifting example aside because that's quite a different beast for a later podcast, because the results of frequency and strength are quite a bit different. But ultimately, I'm just to put my cards on the table, I'm not too worried for myself if I'm doing my 7 sets a week of hamstrings or 8 sets a week of hamstrings, which is about where I'm at right now, all in one session, because that just seems to lead to a little bit more repeatable recovery that I'm actually comfortable pushing that next session in. Again, I think we could have a whole nother discussion about whether true, like you need to be fully recovered to benefit from another session, et cetera, et cetera. But in my case, I'm like, I don't want to do leg curls right now. My hamstrings feel like they're going to come off the bone. So just for me, from like an adherence perspective and from a long-term volume accumulation and just good quality set accumulation, I'm going to train my hamstrings with lower frequencies. But I have other muscles, like, for example, my lateral delts. I've been training them for 4 times a week for a very long time now, and I have very little trouble with that. Progression has been totally fine, and it's not hampered my adherence in terms of just accumulating quality sets on the curve. Now, again, I'm just using that to illustrate how I, just to put my cards on the table as a result of our results, previous results, limitations thereof, I'm not going in there and saying, what is the optimal frequency? I'm more so moving the pieces around the chessboard in order to maximize the quality sets that are occurring over a pretty long time period. And sometimes that leads to pretty low volumes because really high volumes can be unsustainable for some people. Sometimes that leads to pretty dang high volumes and relatively high frequencies, right? So it's, to me, this variable kind of falls under the category, if you will, of like, I don't want to say secondary, but flexible and requires some strategy, if you will, or requires a little bit of troubleshooting. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. The way that I view frequency when training for hypertrophy essentially is just basically every single training variable comes with the presupposition or the assumption that set quality is high and you're training like with high effort, more or less. And I find from a practical perspective, frequency is the variable, and splits are kind of what I'm thinking when I'm thinking of frequency, are what you can manipulate to ensure that assumption is met, more or less. So for you, if I made you go train your hamstrings 4 times a week, I just have a hard time believing that even if the volume per session was basically the same, distributed the same weekly volume over all the sessions, like after a period of time, I have a feeling you would just hate that, and your effort would be compromised, the training enjoyment, all those kind of things, and then obviously the long-term sustainability and the kind of the effort under the curve that you're applying on a very long time scale is then compromised. And any theoretical benefit of frequency, again, this is where I was talking about the cost-benefit analysis, is crucial to understand the benefit so you can appropriately contextualize the cost. That very, very small theoretical benefit, if you take the slope of the dose response from the main model entirely literally, which obviously you shouldn't do, but let's say you did, that minuscule benefit is not worth completely compromising your training effort. That is going to limit the output that you're creating. That's going to drive the majority of the stimulus. So that's essentially my mindset with frequency, more or less. I essentially think all splits or training programs and distributions of volume that people kind of naturally land upon are all reasonable and are all good options, because they basically are all going to train the major muscle groups directly 1 to 3 times a week, and then the fractional is kind of distribute within that range for the most part, which means they're all serviceable relative to our main model. And then from there, it's just about, okay, that's accomplishing the physiological, you're checking that box ultimately. Like, you don't need to think about it really more than that, at least is what our results are basically telling you. And then from there, you're just logistically bumping things up or down to accomplish and satisfy preferences, ability to deal with the soreness and things like that, that you're kind of talking about. And in my case, again, don't want to use the strength examples too much, but like that was basically the only way I could get my bench press to go up, was to manipulate this to a pretty extreme degree. And
frequency.
Then strength is a different example, like you said, but it's just under that premise that like you're just trying to make frequency meet your needs, more or less.
And something I keep coming back to when I think about frequency is I have a hard time suggesting a framework of thinking about a training variable that removes flexibility or removes tools in the toolbox for the lifter or for the coach if I don't have like strong evidence for it. So I could absolutely come up with theoretical rationale that even I like am really intrigued by for higher frequencies being better. And as we've mentioned multiple times, per session volume, per session volumes being higher than they were in the included studies or lower than they were in the included studies. I could come up with potential scenarios where I'm like, frequency absolutely matters so long as XYZ. And again, I might even be intrigued by that. But as a scientist for sure, and even as a coach and in terms of communicating science, no matter which hat I'm using, I currently don't feel comfortable making a strong recommendation based on that, based on the data that we do have. So put more simply, frequency doesn't have a reliable, consistent, independent effect on hypertrophy. So as a scientist, as a coach, as a science communicator, I'm going to allow room for that flexibility, given we do see consistent, reliable, identifiable effects from other training variables, specifically volume and proximity to failure. That doesn't mean you need to do 100 sets a week, right? There's so many caveats to discuss there that we discussed before. For some people, that might be 5 sets a week. For some people, that might be 15, maybe 25. Who knows? So ultimately, that leads me to a recommendation that we've collaborated on that is, again, conceptual in nature. We did include a number here, which is a little bit different for us, but I think in this case, it's a little bit more called for because frequency is quite constrained in terms of just the number of options. And ultimately, what we've landed on is that when volume is accounted for, any benefit of frequency isn't clear or consistent. So when you take that into consideration, alongside the consideration that frequency is often dependent on other training variables and individual considerations, that leads us to believe that there is definitely no one-size-fits-all frequency recommendation. However, when there is no clear downside to training adherence or good quality execution of training, lifters that are looking to hedge their bets may choose to train with a frequency of at least 2 for each muscle group, because our model might have indicated a slightly beneficial effect of frequencies above 1. Again, scientist hat on, I can't say that that is absolutely the case, but it leans in that direction at times, and there are some theoretical rationales why it might be beneficial. But as a coach, as a science communicator, I would also say that frequencies of 1 time per week are totally reasonable if those benefit your adherence and if those benefit your ability to accumulate good quality training and be consistent with it. So that's where we're at with frequency. We have more to come when we discuss per session volumes and dive into some of the nooks and crannies here when we have Jake Remmert on to discuss his manuscript on per session volumes. And as always, there's more research to come. Probably change our minds at some point. Almost certainly change our minds at some point, but here's where we're at. We hope you enjoyed. If you aren't subscribed on YouTube, that's the best place to keep up with the podcast. You could subscribe on your podcast player of choice as well. And Zach, I'll let you close it out.
Thanks, guys. Another great episode. Looking forward to discussing the 2 other outcomes. And yeah, just keep the feedback coming in the comments below for season 2 of the podcast. I've gotten some really good feedback thus far. And yeah, looking forward to do more of these. Thanks for everything. Take care.
Peace.